Hello there. Gentle night owls. Tonight, we follow Edward Cullen through the entire story of Eclipse, the third chapter of the most impossible love story ever told. This is the chapter where danger closes in from every direction, where a newborn army rises in the shadows, and where Bella must make the choice that will define the rest of her existence. With Edward watching, waiting, and learning for the first time what it truly means to be afraid of losing someone. If there's a Twilight story you'd love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I'd love to create it for you. So close your eyes. Let the rain find you, and drift into Forks, where Edward's story is waiting in the dark. The evenings had taken on a particular shape in the weeks following their return from Italy, a shape that felt almost domestic, and almost ordinary if Edward did not examine it too closely. He would arrive at Charlie's house before dinner, would sit at the small kitchen table while Bella worked through her homework, would eat nothing and say little, and watch Charlie move through the familiar rituals of his evening with the quiet, habitual suspicion of a man who had not yet found the right words for what troubled him. The television would murmur in the living room. The rain would find the windows, and Bella would look up from her textbook occasionally and meet Edward's eyes across the table, and something would pass between them that required no words and left no trace that Charlie could examine. It was a peaceful arrangement on its surface. Edward knew better than to trust surfaces. Beneath the peace was a tightening. He could feel it in the conversations he and Bella had that circled certain subjects without landing on them, in the careful way she phrased things when Jacob's name was involved, in the quality of Charlie's silences when Edward stayed too late or arrived too early. The world that had briefly opened when Bella chose to return from Italy with him was already beginning to close again, contracting around the particular pressure points that had always defined their life together. The thirst was always there, the constant burn in his throat that no amount of hunting fully resolved. The voices of the people around him were always there, the endless tide of thought that had been his companion and his prison for nearly a century. And now there was something new added to the familiar weight of his existence, something he examined with an honesty that did not flatter him. He was controlling her. He knew it. He had the clarity to name it, which was perhaps the one thing that distinguished him from the less examined version of the same behavior. But the naming did not make it stop being true. The letter had been the worst of it. He had found it on her desk on the Tuesday evening in late September, sealed and addressed in Bella's careful handwriting to Jacob Black, La Push, Washington. He had looked at it for a long moment before picking it up, before turning it over in his hands, before making the decision that he would spend the following days regretting with an intensity that surprised even him. He had opened it. He had read every word, and then he had folded it carefully along its original creases, replaced it in its envelope, and set it back on the desk exactly as he had found it, as if the precision of the replacement could retroactively undo the violation of the act itself. The letter was warm and apologetic, and full of the particular grief of was saying the things she had not been, was saying the things she had not been able to say in person, because Edward had been present for every attempt. She was not writing anything that should have disturbed him. That was the part he could not escape. She was being kind and honest, and exactly the person he had fallen in love with, and he had read her private words without permission, because fear had temporarily displaced his better judgment. He had not mailed a letter. He told himself, in the hours that followed, that the decision not to mail it was about the danger of contact between Bella and the wolf pack, about the volatility of young werewolves, about the genuine risk that Jacob's increasingly unstable emotional state posed to Bella's physical safety. He constructed this justification carefully and examined it from multiple angles, and found that it held under scrutiny in the way that all justifications hold when you are the one doing the examining, when the outcome you want and the conclusion you are working toward are already decided before the examination begins. The truth, which he had the decency to acknowledge in the privacy of his own mind, even if he acknowledged it to no one else, was simpler and less flattering. He was afraid of Jacob Black, not of Jacob's claws or Jacob's size, or the destructive capacity of the wolf that lived beneath the boy's skin. He was afraid of what Jacob represented to Bella, of the warmth she turned toward when she was near him, of the ease that characterized their friendship in ways that her relationship with Edward had never quite managed. Edward had read thousands of minds across nearly a century of existence, and he knew, with the certainty of someone who has seen too much of human nature to maintain comfortable illusions, that what Bella felt for Jacob was real. It was different from what she felt for Edward, but different was not lesser, and he had never been able to convince himself otherwise, no matter how many times he tried. Charlie's thoughts were not subtle. They rarely were. The police chief of Forks, Washington, was a man of straightforward emotional architecture and limited interest in disguising what he thought, and what he thought about Edward Cullen in this period was something Edward was forced to absorb in its entirety every time he sat in that kitchen. The suspicion was there as it had always been, but beneath the suspicion, sharpened by everything Charlie knew and suspected about the events of the previous spring, was something closer to active dislike. Charlie could not have articulated the specifics of his concern. He did not know what Edward was, but he knew that his daughter had nearly died, that the explanation he had been given for it was insufficient, that Edward was somehow at the center of whatever had actually happened, and that Bella had returned from Arizona changed in ways Charlie lacked the vocabulary to describe. Edward could not argue with a word of it. That was the particular difficulty of sitting in Charlie Swan's kitchen 3 evenings a week and absorbing the unspoken verdict of a man who saw the situation more clearly than most. Charlie's protectiveness of Bella was not irrational or overblown. It was one of the most reasonable things Edward encountered on a regular basis, and the fact that it was directed at him did not make it wrong. The argument about Jacob had come on a Wednesday. Bella had asked, carefully, and with the precise tone of someone who's been rehearsing a request, whether she could visit Jacob on the reservation. Edward had heard her preparing the question across an entire evening, had tracked its construction through the subtle changes in her posture and the quality of her silences, and when it finally arrived, he had answered it poorly. He had been too quick with his objections, had listed the safety concerns in a sequence that he could hear, even as he spoke, sounding less like genuine caution and more like a catalogue of reasons he had been assembling in preparation for exactly this conversation. She had not raised her voice. Bella rarely raised her voice, but the disappointment that moved through her expression when he finished speaking was worse than anger would have been. She looked at him the way you look at someone who has done something small and unkind, that they are trying to dress up as something large and principled, and the accuracy of that look had stayed with him long after the conversation ended. The Seattle situation had entered their evenings as a quieter thread, less immediately painful, but growing in a way that Edward tracked with a part of his mind that never fully rested. Carlisle had contact among the vampire population of the Pacific Northwest. Other covens who maintained cautious lines of communication, and what those contacts were reporting had been filtering back to the Cullen house in pieces over the preceding weeks. Disappearances in Seattle, at first unremarkable in the way that the disappearances of young people in a large city were always unremarkable to human authorities, were accumulating beyond the threshold of coincidence. There was a pattern beneath the chaos, a particular signature in the nature of the deaths and the absence of bodies that Edward had learned to recognize across a long lifetime. Newborns, newly transformed vampires in the first months of their existence, when the bloodlust was at its most extreme and the control was at its most minimal. Someone was creating them. Someone was pointing them at the city and letting the chaos serve some purpose that was not yet visible from the outside. He brought this to Bella carefully, on an evening when Charlie had gone to bed early, and the kitchen was quiet except for the rain and the low sound of the news from the living room television. He watched her absorb it, watched the fear move through her, and then settle into the focused attention she brought to things that frightened her. The refusal to let fear become paralysis. She asked the right questions. She always asked the right questions, which was one of the 10,000 things about her that had been slowly undoing him since the beginning. He drove home through the dark and the rain afterward, with her heartbeat still present in his memory, the particular rhythm of it that he had memorized so completely he could hear it in his mind when she was not present, a phantom sound that filled the silence where her thoughts should have been. He sat in the driveway of the Cullen house for a long time before going inside, listening to the forest and the rain and the absence of anything that needed his immediate attention. And he asked himself honestly what kind of being he wanted to be in this relationship. Not the kind that reads private letters, not the kind that assembles catalogues of safety concerns to avoid acknowledging the jealousy underneath them. Not the kind that manages Bella Swan rather than trusting her. He had spent nearly a century constructing a careful version of himself, a version that chose restraint over instinct, that selected the civilized response over the monstrous one, that said no to the darkness inside him with the patience and repetition of someone who understood that the choosing never became permanent, that it had to be done again every day. He could extend that discipline to this. He could choose to trust her. He could loosen his grip and discover whether what they had was strong enough to hold without him clenching it. It was, he thought. He believed it was. But believing it and living as if he believed it were, he was finding rather different things, and the distance between them was the work that Eclipse was quietly requiring of him. He went inside. Alice was waiting, as Alice always was, her expression carefully neutral in the way it became when her visions had shown her something she was choosing not to share. Edward met her eyes across the entrance hall and understood immediately that she had seen something, and that whatever it was the beginning of something rather than the end. She tilted her head slightly in the direction of Carlyle's study. A new report from Seattle then. Something that had clarified in the last few hours while he had been sitting in Bella's kitchen watching Charlie watch him. He followed her down the hall. Outside, the rain continued its familiar conversation with the forest. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees, the shape of the summer that was coming was already assembling itself, patient and enormous, waiting to be seen. The decision came on a Thursday morning, quietly, the way the most significant decisions often did, not with ceremony or announcement, but with the simple internal settling of something that had been held in tension for too long finally releasing. Edward had been sitting in the Cullen house in the grey early hours before school. The house still and silent around him in the particular way it was silent when Alice was not having visions, and Jasper was meditating, and Emmett and Rosalie were elsewhere, and Carlyle and Esme were simply existing in the peaceful companionship of two people who had chosen each other across a very long time. He'd been thinking about Bella, and about Jacob, and about the letter he had intercepted, and about the man he had examined himself to be in the aftermath of that interception. And when the thinking was finished, the decision was simply there, already made, waiting to be acknowledged. He would allow the visit, more than allow it. He would offer it, which was different, which required something from him that permission alone did not. He drove to Charlie's house that morning with the specific quality of attention he brought to things that were going to be difficult. Bella was in the kitchen when he arrived, her backpack already by the door, her expression carrying the careful neutrality she had developed for mornings when she was not certain what version of Edward she would encounter. He had taught her that caution, he knew, had made her uncertain enough about his responses that she had learned to approach him with her feelings already managed, already prepared for the possibility of disappointment. That knowledge sat in him like a stone. He told her she could see Jacob. He watched her face change. The relief that moved through her expression was immediate and unguarded and honest in the way that Bella was always honest when she forgot to be careful, and Edward held it without flinching because it deserved to be held rather than explained away. She was relieved. She had wanted this and had been denied it, and now it was being returned to her, and she was glad. Those were simply the facts of the moment, and he chose to let them be facts rather than injuries. She asked him if he was certain. He told her he was. She studied him for a moment with those brown eyes that had never once given him access to the thoughts behind them, and whatever she found in his face appeared to satisfy her, because she nodded once and reached for her bag, and the morning continued. The drive to the treaty line happened on a Saturday, the sky the particular shade of grey that Fawkes produced in the hours between one type of rain and another. The light flat and diffuse and gentle in the way that Edward had come to associate with the specific character of this place that had become, despite everything, something close to home. Bella sat beside him in the Volvo, and they talked about ordinary things, about her upcoming English paper and a film she had watched with Charlie the previous evening, and the conversation had the quality of two people being brave about something by not mentioning it, which was its own kind of tenderness. He parked at the place where the logging road narrowed and the forest changed, where the trees on the Quileute side grew differently somehow. Or perhaps it was only that he perceived them differently, knowing he could not follow beyond that invisible line. Bella got out and gathered her jacket around her against the October chill and looked at him across the roof of the car with an expression he could not fully read. She said she would be back before dark. He said he would be here. She walked into the trees, and the forest closed around her, and the sound of her heartbeat faded by degrees until it was gone entirely. Edward stood at the boundary for a long time after she disappeared. The specific quality of this particular silence was unlike any other silence in his experience. He had spent decades cultivating a tolerance for the noise of human minds, had developed the ability to filter and manage the constant incoming tide of thought that his gift forced upon him. Silence, true silence, existed for him only in the wilderness far from human habitation, or in those extraordinary moments near Bella when the noise simply ceased. But this silence was different from both of those. This was not the peace of her presence. This was the silence of her absence, of knowing she was somewhere near but unreachable, of having no heartbeat to listen for, and no thoughts to accidentally intercept, and no way of knowing what was happening on the other side of a line he could not cross. He hunted to occupy himself, moved deeper into the Olympic forest on his side of the boundary, tracked a small herd of elk with the automatic efficiency of long practice, took what he needed and moved on. The physical activity helped in the way it always helped, giving the predator's body something legitimate to do so that the predator's mind could work on other things. His thoughts during those hours were not particularly orderly. They circled the same territory repeatedly, the way thoughts do when they are working through something that resists resolution. He thought about Jacob Black with as much honesty as he could bring to the subject. This required setting aside the jealousy, which was real, and which he had stopped pretending was only protective concern, and looking at Jacob as he actually was, rather than as Edward's fear needed him to be. What he found when he looked honestly was a person of considerable substance. Jacob was 17 years old and had been transformed into something ancient and enormous and difficult to manage without choosing it, without preparation, without any of the philosophical scaffolding that Carlyle had provided for Edward across the long years of his own transformation's aftermath. Jacob had absorbed that change and had not broken under it, had found within it something he could use, a purpose, a belonging to his tribe and his land and the long story of his people. Edward could respect that, even when it cost him something to do so. He returned to the boundary as the afternoon light began to change. The elk blood had settled the thirst to its usual manageable ache, and he felt clearer, more able to simply exist in the uncertainty of the wait without catastrophizing it. He sat against a tree at the edge of his territory and listened to the forest and let the hours pass. Jasper found him somewhere in the middle of the afternoon. Edward had been aware of his brother's approach for several minutes before Jasper appeared between the trees, moving with the quiet that was as natural to him as breathing had once been to both of them. Jasper settled against a tree a few feet away and said nothing for a while, which was entirely characteristic and entirely welcome. Edward could feel Jasper's empathic attention on him, that gentle, ambient awareness of another person's emotional state that Jasper maintained without effort. He was not projecting anything, not attempting to adjust or smooth what Edward was feeling. He was simply noting it, the way a good doctor notes a patient's condition without immediately trying to change it. They talked eventually about small things first and then about larger ones. Jasper spoke about the early years with Alice, about the specific difficulty of loving someone whose gift meant she frequently knew what he was feeling before he had fully acknowledged it himself, about the way that kind of intimacy required a person to become more honest with themselves than was strictly comfortable, because concealment became futile and the energy spent on it was better directed elsewhere. Edward listened to this and heard the oblique kindness in it, the way Jasper was offering him something useful without ever directly addressing the situation that had brought them both to this particular stretch of forest on this particular afternoon. He asked Jasper once, directly, whether he thought Edward was doing the right thing. Jasper was quiet for a moment before he answered, and when he answered, he chose his words with the care of someone who understood that the wrong framing could close a door that needed to stay open. He said that he thought Edward was doing the necessary thing, which was related to but not identical with the right thing, and that the distinction was worth sitting with rather than collapsing. Edward sat with it. The light was beginning to lean toward evening when he heard her returning. The sound of her footsteps on the forest floor, irregular in the way that Bella's footsteps were always irregular, her particular rhythm of movement that he had memorized as completely as her heartbeat, and then the heartbeat itself, faint at first, and then growing, becoming audible as she crossed back across the boundary and moved through the trees toward him. She emerged from the forest with her hair loose around her face and her cheeks slightly flushed from the cold and the walk, and she was carrying something in her expression that Edward had learned to recognize over the months of their relationship. It was the specific brightness of someone who has spent a few hours in uncomplicated ease, in company that did not require them to manage or protect or be careful. She looked lighter. She looked like a version of herself that he did not always get to see. He did not ask her what they had talked about. She did not immediately volunteer it. He opened the car door for her and she got in, and he walked around to the driver's side and the drive began, and after several minutes she started talking in the quiet way she used for things she was still processing. Jacob had been glad to see her. They had walked on the beach at La Push and talked about ordinary things, and some things that were not ordinary, and she had felt, for a few hours, like herself in a way that was harder to access lately. Edward listened to all of this and did not perform a response. He felt what he felt, which included the jealousy and the complicated gratitude and the simple relief that she was sitting beside him, whole and warm and speaking honestly, and he let all of it exist simultaneously without requiring any one of those feelings to win. He reached across and took her hand on the center console. Not urgently, just a quiet physical acknowledgement that he was here, that the hours she had spent with Jacob had not changed anything fundamental between them. She looked at him when he did that, a quick sideways glance, and he thought he saw something relax in her that had been held carefully since the morning. The drive back to Forks took them through the last of the afternoon light and into the early dark of an October evening. By the time they reached Charlie Street, the rain had begun again, softly, the way it always began in this place, as if the sky considered it a courtesy to ease in gradually, rather than announce itself all at once. Edward walked her to the door and said goodnight, and stood on the porch for a moment after she had gone inside, listening to the familiar sounds of Charlie's household resuming its evening rhythms. He drove home through the wet streets with his mind already moving toward the other thread of this period, the one that existed beneath the personal complications and demanded its own attention. Carlyle was waiting with a new report. 3 more disappearances confirmed in Seattle. The pattern sharper now, the signature of newborn violence unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. Whoever was building this army was not being careful about concealment. Either they were too inexperienced to know how to hide what they were doing, or they did not care whether it was hidden. Neither possibility was reassuring, and the fact that the army was growing while the Cullens were occupied with alliance meetings and treaty lines and the personal complications of a vampire in love with a human girl was not lost on Edward as he pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment in the dark car, listening to the rain on the roof, feeling the shape of the summer ahead beginning to declare itself. He went inside. The house was bright and warm, with a particular quality of warmth that Esme created in whatever space she occupied, and the voices of his family moved through the rooms with a comfortable familiarity of people who had shared a very long time together. He found Carlyle in his study and sat down across from him, and they talked for a long time about Seattle, about the reports, about what was being built in that city and what it might eventually be pointed at. Outside, the rain continued, and somewhere across Forks, in a small house on a quiet street, Bella Swan was falling asleep, her heartbeat slowing into the rhythm he knew as well as anything in his long existence, steady and warm, and for tonight at least, safe. It came during a quiet evening in the Cullen house, the kind of quiet that existed in the spaces between things, between conversations and hunts, and the small, necessary performances of daily life. Edward was at the piano, not playing anything with intention, but moving through fragments, half-formed progressions that dissolved before they became complete. The musical equivalent of thinking without arriving at a conclusion. Esme was reading in the chair nearest the window. Carlyle was in his study with the door open, the soft sound of pages turning carrying down the hallway with the comfortable regularity of a sound Edward had been hearing for decades. The rest of the family was distributed through the house in the ambient way of people who had shared a space long enough that their proximity registered as texture rather than event. Their thoughts a familiar low tide of consciousness that he had learned to receive without actively processing. He was working through a progression in a minor key that he had been returning to for several weeks without understanding why it kept calling him back. Something unresolved in the harmonic movement that refused to settle into the conclusion his ear kept expecting. When Alice appeared in the doorway, Edward felt it before he saw it. The specific quality of her absence that preceded a vision. The way her mind became suddenly inaccessible to him, closing off behind whatever mechanism the future employed when it was pulling her attention forward into territory that belonged to moments not yet arrived. He turned on the piano bench and watched her face with the practiced attention of someone who had been reading this particular person for decades, cataloguing the small involuntary signals her body produced, even when her conscious mind was entirely elsewhere. The slight tension at the corners of her jaw, the fractional inward curl of her hands which had been loose at her sides, the particular stillness of her breathing. Whatever she was seeing, it was not small and it was not distant. She came back to herself after nearly 40 seconds, which was long by Alice's measure, and her eyes found Edward's immediately with the specific urgency of someone who has witnessed something they do not want to carry alone for even the brief time it would take to speak it aloud. He was already crossing the room toward her before she had fully returned. "Edward," she said, her voice pitched below human hearing. "Get Carlyle." He was in Carlyle's study doorway in the same moment, and Carlyle looked up from his desk and read whatever was present in Edward's expression with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 3 centuries learning this family's faces. He set down his pen without being asked and stood, and they moved together back to the living room where Alice was waiting. The rest of the family gathered with the quiet speed of people who understood that Alice standing very still in the center of a room meant something that warranted their full attention. Emmett came down the stairs. Rosalie followed. Jasper appeared from the direction of the back hallway. Esme had already set down her book. When they were all present, Alice described what she had seen. Edward listened to her words and simultaneously received the images directly from her mind. The 2 streams of information arriving together and layering over each other in the way that always made second-hand visions feel more immediate than they should. The verbal description and the visual memory together painted something that settled in his chest with a cold and very specific weight. Dozens of them, moving through the dark in a loose, directionless mass, red-eyed and burning with the particular frenzy of the newly transformed, that first terrible year of existence when the thirst was not a discomfort to be managed, but an absolute consuming imperative that left room for almost nothing else. They moved the way newborns always moved, with the uncoordinated excess of people who had been given enormous physical power before they possessed any framework for directing it. Their violence turned outward in every direction simultaneously without discipline or purpose. Buildings along a waterfront, the specific grey geometry of a Pacific Northwest city seen from above at night, the water catching what little light the sky offered. Seattle. He was certain before Alice confirmed it. "How many?" Carlyle said. It was not quite a question. More than 20, Alice said. The number keeps shifting. Someone is still adding to them. The army is not finished. The word army occupied the room for a moment. Edward watched his family receive it. He did what he always did in moments that required clear thinking alongside emotional management, which was to move his attention deliberately around the room and read each person with the thorough efficiency of someone for whom reading people was not a learned skill, but a biological fact. Emmett's response came first and fastest. The brightness that entered his expression when something presented itself as a genuine physical challenge. The forward orientation of a person whose instinct was always toward the problem rather than away from it. There was no fear in Emmett's immediate response. There was something closer to relief. The relief of someone who'd been prepared for a very long time for something that had now finally arrived and could therefore be dealt with. Rosalie's surface remained composed. The careful, beautiful neutrality she maintained in moments of threat, but beneath it, Edward could read the fear she managed with the discipline of someone who had learned across many decades that visible fear invited exploitation, and that the most useful thing one could do with it was convert it into fuel for clear action. Esme had gone very still, which was her particular form of distress. The way she drew herself inward when something moved against the family she had spent so long building from broken and discarded pieces. Her thoughts were not strategic. They were maternal and specific, moving through each of her children in sequence with the focused love of someone taking inventory of what matters most. And then there was Jasper. The change in him was the most striking thing in the room, and Edward had been watching for it from the moment Alice began to speak, because he had seen it before and he knew its shape. The Jasper who existed within this family managed his empathic gift with tireless attention and deferred with genuine respect to Carlyle's leadership, and loved Alice with a constancy that was one of the most quietly extraordinary things Edward had ever had the sustained proximity to witness. Did not disappear exactly, but he receded. What moved into the foreground in his place was something older and considerably more dangerous, the version of Jasper that preceded Alice and the Cullens, and the long, difficult work of becoming something other than what Maria had made him. The military bearing became visible in his posture, not performed but structural, as natural to him as breathing had once been to both of them. The tactical assessment moved behind his eyes with the speed and precision of a mind that had spent decades thinking in terms of terrain and numbers and the specific vulnerabilities of different kinds of opponents. Edward felt the complicated response this always produced in him. Gratitude, because this version of Jasper was exactly what the situation required, and there was no one in the family better equipped for what was coming. And grief, quieter but real, for the cost of what Jasper was doing, for the thing he was reaching back into himself to retrieve, and what retrieving it required him to touch. "This is not random," Jasper said. The words were flat and certain, in the way of someone stating a fact they arrived at through experience rather than reasoning. "No," Edward said. "Someone is managing them, containing them to the city, preventing the kind of dispersal that would draw the Volturi's attention too quickly. Someone who understands how newborns behave and how to direct that behavior toward a specific end." "Which means someone who has done this before," Jasper said. or someone who has had help from someone who has, Carlyle said. The silence that followed contained the implication none of them had yet spoken aloud. An army was not built to remain stationary. It was built to be moved and then used, and the question of what it was intended to be used against was one that Edward had been turning over in his mind since Alice's vision had first clarified, and the answer he kept arriving at was not one he was willing to introduce into the room without more certainty than he currently possessed. He filed it away and stayed with the conversation that was already happening. Carlyle reached for his phone. The calls he made across the following hour were careful and measured, extending through the network of cautious relationships he had maintained across 3 centuries of deliberate community building among the wider vampire population. Tanya's family in Alaska responded with genuine warmth and genuine concern, and the carefully non-committal regard for direct involvement that Edward had expected and did not hold against them. A coven further south was colder. An older vampire in British Columbia, one who had been present during the Southern Wars of the previous century, and whose knowledge of newborn armies was therefore not theoretical, provided information that required significant patience to extract from beneath layers of deliberate vagueness, but that confirmed, once extracted, what Jasper's instincts had already suggested. This had a shape, this had a purpose, and it was closer to completion than any of them would have preferred. The Volturi emissary arrived 3 days after Alice's vision. Edward tracked the unfamiliar mind from a considerable distance, registering its approach across the evening landscape with the alert attention he brought to any consciousness he did not immediately recognize. The thoughts were practiced in their blankness, shaped by training into something that revealed as little as possible while projecting the specific quality of sanctioned authority that the Volturi's representatives all carried. That particular combination of confidence and menace that functioned as a kind of credential. It was Dimitri rather than Jane, which Edward considered with the careful interpretive attention that all Volturi communication demanded. Dimitri was a tracker. His presence meant the Volturi were locating and assessing rather than punishing. For the moment, the emphasis fell on observation rather than enforcement. The conversation at the front door was brief and formal, and conducted in the layered register that characterized all Volturi interaction. The surface meaning and the actual meaning running parallel to each other, like 2 rivers that occasionally touched. The Volturi were aware of the situation in Seattle. They expected the Cullen family, given their established presence in this territory, to manage the resolution of that situation. They would be observing. Edward relayed the subtext to Carlyle after Dimitri had gone, though Carlyle had passed it clearly enough himself. He means that if we cannot handle this, they will, Edward said, and their handling will not be careful about what it damages in the process. I know what he means, Carlyle said quietly. We handle this ourselves. The question of Bella had been present throughout all of it, sitting at the edge of every conversation like something that had been agreed not to name until the naming became unavoidable. Edward had been holding it across the entire week, examining it from the angle of transparency and from the angle of protection, and finding each time that both of those angles had genuine claims on his consideration, and that the discomfort of holding them in tension was not going to resolve itself through further delay. She was the most probable target. The army's containment, its deliberate growth, the patience with which it was being assembled and held, all of it traced, most naturally, to a purpose that was specific rather than general. Someone was not building 20 vampires to terrorize a city. Someone was building 20 vampires to overwhelm a particular defense. She deserved to know. Not because the knowledge would protect her in any immediate practical sense, but because she was a person who moved through her own life with intention and honesty, and the consistent refusal to be managed, and treating her as someone who needed to be shielded from the truth of her own situation was a form of disrespect that Edward had already learned the cost of and had no interest in paying again. He told her on a Tuesday evening, sitting at Charlie's kitchen table after dinner, while the television murmured from the living room and the rain performed its regular attendance on the windows. He told her carefully and in sequence, watching her face as each piece of information arrived, reading the response she produced with the attentiveness of someone who has learned to work entirely from surfaces because the interior is and will always remain inaccessible. The fear moved through her eyes briefly, a flash of something genuine that came and was replaced almost immediately by the focused quality of attention she brought to difficult things. She did not reach for reassurance. She did not perform the brave face he had seen other people construct in moments like this, the deliberate arrangement of features designed to demonstrate courage rather than actually embody it. She simply settled the way she always settled when something required her full engagement, into the version of herself that met hard things directly and without decoration. "Is it Victoria?" she asked. The precision of the question stopped him. He had been building toward Victoria's name, assembling the evidence in the order that seemed most coherent, and she had arrived at the conclusion before he completed the architecture. "We believe so," he said. "We cannot confirm it yet, but the patience of it, the scale of it, the fact that it's being directed rather than simply released, it points towards someone with a specific grievance rather than general ambition." "Patient is worse," Bella said. "Yes," Edward said. "Patient is worse." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands flat on the table, and then she raised her eyes to his with the expression he had learned to recognize as the one she wore when she had already decided something and was not requesting permission for it. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the version that has been considered for my benefit. Everything that you know and everything that you suspect." So he told her everything. The full scope of what Alice had seen, the number of newborns and the rate at which they were being added, the Volturi emissary's visit and the message beneath the message, Jasper's assessment of what a directed newborn army of that size would require to stop and what stopping it would cost. He told her about Victoria's patience, about the years she had spent circling rather than striking, about the intelligence that had been building something this deliberate while they had been occupied with the smaller daily work of their lives. Bella listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment in the way she was quiet when she was not avoiding a response, but genuinely processing one. Then she said, simply and without drama, "What do we do?" The "we" of it moved through him like something warm and slightly painful. Not "what do you do?" or "what will your family do?" but "what do we do?" the pronoun of someone who'd already decided which side of this she was on and considered the matter settled. "We prepare," Edward said, carefully and together. Outside, the rain continued its patient work on the roof of Charlie's house. In the living room, the evening news delivered its catalogue of ordinary human concerns. And at the kitchen table, in the particular, quality of silence that existed between two people who had just agreed to face something enormous together. Edward and Bella sat with the shape of what was coming, and neither of them looked away. The ring had been in the house for decades. Edward had not thought about it deliberately, had not taken it out and looked at it with any regularity or allowed himself to imagine the circumstances under which it might leave its small velvet box and find its way onto another person's hand. It had been with him since Chicago, since the last days of his human life and the first days of everything that followed. One of the few material objects he had carried forward across the long distance between who he had been and what he had become. His mother's ring, a gold setting, ornate in the fashion of 1918 in a way that was both entirely of its time and somehow beyond it. The central stone surrounded by a constellation of smaller ones that caught light and distributed it quietly rather than demanding attention. He had not kept it out of sentiment exactly, or not only out of sentiment. He had kept it because it was hers and she was gone, and the ring was one of the last places she still existed in any tangible form in the world. He took it out on a Wednesday evening in early November and held it in his palm for a long time, alone in his room while the rain worked steadily on the windows and the house settled into its evening quiet around him. The light caught the central stone and moved through it in the particular way that light behaved around anything cut precisely enough to deserve that kind of attention. He thought about Elizabeth Mason's hands, which he remembered with a specific and undiminishing vividness that his vampire memory applied to things it had decided to preserve regardless of the years accumulating between the remembering and the original moment. Long fingers. The economy of movement of a woman who managed a household with quiet efficiency and considerable grace, who never wasted a gesture, who communicated more through the quality of her stillness than most people communicated through speech. She had worn this ring every day of her adult life until the influenza had made her fingers too thin to keep it on, and even then she had kept it on a ribbon around her neck, close to her skin, refusing to be separated from a thing that marked her choosing even as everything else was being taken. It had been on that ribbon when she died in the hospital in the early hours of a morning in 1918, in a ward across the city from the room where her son was burning with venom and becoming something she had asked for without fully understanding what she was asking. Carlyle had given it to him years afterward, once Edward had stabilized enough for the conversation about human life and human loss, and the objects that persisted after both. Edward had taken it and placed it carefully in a box and put it away, and had not thought about it in the particular direct way that leads to decisions. Not once across the following decades. Not through the long, empty years of wandering and the return to Carlyle's family, and the repeated cycling through high schools, and the accumulated weight of a century, without anything he wanted badly enough to reach toward. Until now. Until Bella Swan had walked into a biology classroom, and been silent where every other person in his long experience had been noise, and the entire carefully managed architecture of his existence had begun, slowly and then all at once, to rearrange itself around the fact of her. He was not going to approach this as a performance. That was the decision he had made first and most firmly, before any of the other decisions had resolved themselves. He'd spent the better part of a century inside other people's proposals, had received them involuntarily through the minds of the people making them and the people receiving them, had catalogued, without wanting, to every variation of the gesture across 100 years of human courtship in every register, from the genuinely moving to the catastrophically mishandled. What he had extracted from that involuntary education, the one useful thing, was that the proposals that actually meant something were the ones that had abandoned construction entirely, that had arrived not as the execution of a carefully prepared plan, but as the honest overflow of something that had become too large to be adequately contained by continued silence. He was not going to rehearse. Whatever came out would come out once, in the moment, from whatever was actually true. He trusted that what was true was sufficient. He had to trust that. The question of setting was practical rather than theatrical. Not where would make the best impression, but where Bella would be most fully herself, most able to receive something without the social management that public spaces required, most free from the performance that came with being observed. His room, the place that was most genuinely and unguardedly his, that he had not arranged for anyone else's consumption, that held the things that actually mattered. The music, accumulated across decades of genuine love for it, rather than affectation. The books whose spines showed real use. The window that looked into the forest where the light came through old growth trees in that particular way. Diffused and green and ancient and indifferent to human time. If he was going to ask her to choose him, he should ask her in the place that was most honestly him, so that what she was choosing was visible rather than curated. He asked her to come on a Thursday afternoon, telling her only that he wanted to show her something, which was true in the immediate sense, and true in a much larger sense that he did not articulate even to himself. She arrived at the Cullen house in the late afternoon light of November, which in Forks meant the light was already angling toward early dark. The sky, the dense pewter of a day that had never quite decided to be fully bright. He met her at the door and walked with her upstairs and into his room and closed the door behind them with the quiet, deliberate click of someone who has finished deliberating. Bella settled onto the sofa and looked at him with the expression she wore when she was paying very close attention and had decided not to direct the conversation. The particular quality of open waiting that was one of the things he had come to recognize as distinctively hers. The willingness to let things arrive in their own time, rather than forcing them toward the resolution that impatience demanded. He had loved that quality in her since early in their acquaintance, that capacity to inhabit a moment without immediately trying to reshape it into something more manageable. Most people he had found across a long lifetime of involuntary intimacy with human consciousness could not tolerate uncertainty for more than a few seconds before they began filling it with noise. Bella could simply be in it, quiet and present and waiting, and that stillness had been one of the first things about her that had reached him. He stood for a moment, and then he moved to his desk and took the velvet box from the drawer where he had placed it that morning with hands that had been steadier than he expected. And he turned and crossed the room and held it out toward her so that she could see what it was before he opened it, giving her the moment of recognition before the thing itself was fully visible. He watched her face change, not with the alarm or the pulling back that had lived in the back of his mind as a possibility through all the weeks of thinking about this. Not with the performance of pleased surprise that people sometimes produced when they felt an emotion but were not certain they were feeling it correctly. What moved through her expression was something quieter and more genuine than either of those. A kind of recognition, as if something she had been aware of approaching without quite naming it had finally arrived close enough to see clearly. He opened the box. "This was my mother's," he said, and his voice was steadier than he had anticipated. Steadier than seemed entirely proportionate, given what was occurring in the place in his chest where a heartbeat would have been. Elizabeth Mason wore it every day of her marriage to my father. She was wearing it on the night she was brought to the hospital, on the night she looked at Carlyle and asked him to save me. I have carried it since 1918, and I have never once, in all the years between that night and this one, considered giving it to another person. He paused. Bella had not moved. Her eyes had travelled from the ring to his face and had remained there, holding the specific intensity she brought to things that she had decided deserved her complete attention. "Until you," he said. "Everything about my understanding of what I wanted from this existence, or whether I wanted anything at all beyond the management of one day and then the next, changed when you walked into that classroom and were silent, where every other person has always been noise. You gave me back the experience of quiet. You gave me the experience of not knowing, which I had believed was lost to me permanently. You gave me something to want." He moved then, and it was not so much a decision as a physical inevitability. One knee on the floor in front of the sofa where she sat, the open ring box held between them, the stone catching the room's low November light and handling it with quiet precision. "I am not asking you to accept what I am," he said. "You accomplished that long ago, with more generosity than I had any right to expect or request. I am asking you to choose me in the particular way that human beings have marked their permanent choosing of each other, for as long as choosing has meant something. I am asking you to marry me, Bella." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a moment that has been building for a long time, finally arriving. The silence that exists, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening simultaneously, and language has become temporarily insufficient to the scale of it. She looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at him, still on one knee on the floor of his room, and her expression was the one he could never entirely read, the one that lived behind the silence his gift could not penetrate. And he waited with the patience of someone who has learned that the waiting is part of the thing and not separate from it. "I want to say yes," she said carefully. "I do want to say yes, but I need you to understand something before I do, and I need you to actually understand it rather than simply accept it, because it's what's required to get to the answer you want." "Tell me," he said. "Marriage means something specific to me," she said, "and he could hear the effort she was making to be honest without being unkind, the care she was bringing to a truth that had sharp edges. Not something good. My parents were married, and the shape of what that looked like and what it cost all three of us has made the word feel like a pattern I was supposed to learn from rather than repeat. When I imagine myself married, I feel like someone wearing a piece of clothing that was made for a different person's body. It doesn't fit the shape of how I have always thought about my own future. I know, Edward said. He did know. He had known it for a long time, had read the shape of it in the specific way she sometimes went careful around certain conversations about the future, had understood it through what she chose not to say as clearly as through what she said aloud. I am not asking you to repeat your parents' experience. I am not asking you to step into a shape that has already proven itself inadequate. I am asking you to make something that has never existed before because we have never existed before. What we build will be ours entirely. It will not look like anything that came before it. She absorbed this in the particular way she absorbed things that required genuine processing, rather than simple reception. He watched it move through her and waited for it to settle. There are things I want first, she said then, and her voice had shifted slightly, becoming more direct. The voice she used when she had decided to stop approaching something obliquely and simply say it. Things I want to have had as a human before everything changes. Things I am not willing to simply skip past because we are moving toward a different kind of future. Tell me what you want, he said. She told him. The directness of it was entirely characteristic, the specificity of it slightly startling in the best way, the honesty of it requiring him to meet her at the same level of honesty in his response. He listened to the full shape of what she was, asking before he said anything, genuinely listened rather than preparing his answer while she was still speaking. His fear was real, and he named it plainly, not as a refusal, and not as a performance of noble restraint, but as a truth she needed to hold alongside the yes he wanted to give her. The fear of his own strength, the fear of what a single moment of lost control could mean for a body as fragile as hers, the specific horror that lived in the possibility of hurting the person he was most completely devoted to protecting. He explained it without dressing it in more acceptable language, because she had asked for honesty, and she deserved the actual version of it, rather than the palatable approximation. They negotiated across the next hour with the careful honesty of two people who had learned through specific and sometimes painful experience that pretending toward agreement produced considerably worse outcomes than the discomfort of genuine disagreement followed by genuine resolution. He would try, with every condition she was willing to accept, and several she had not yet thought to ask for. She would accept the limits that his fear required him to name, would understand them as fear rather than rejection, would marry him with the full knowledge of what the arrangement included and what it could not yet include. He would give her the human experiences she needed to keep. She would give him the formal permanence of her choosing. When it settled quietly, the way things settle when they have been reached through honesty rather than negotiation, without the residual uncertainty that compromise leaves behind when neither person has been fully heard. He lifted the ring from the box and held it toward her, and she extended her left hand across the small distance between them, and he placed Elizabeth Mason's ring on Bella Swan's finger with a steadiness that cost him something he did not have a precise name for, something that lived at the intersection of grief and gratitude, and a particular quality of feeling that belonged to irreversible moments, moments that divided time into the part before and the part after. The ring fit her hand as if it had been made for it, which it had not been, which was the kind of small coincidence that Edward, who had spent a long time in a world too strange for ordinary coincidence to seem surprising, chose to receive simply as what it appeared to be: a rightness, an acknowledgement from some indifferent universe that this particular combination of elements had produced something that belonged together. Bella looked at her hand for a long, still moment. The ring caught the November light coming through the window and turned it into something quieter and more private than light usually was. Then she looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one he'd come to love most specifically, the unguarded one, the one that existed before she had decided how to present what she was. Floor and settled beside her on the sofa floor, and settled beside her on the sofa, and she leaned into his side, and he put his arm around her with the careful, habitual gentleness of someone who never entirely forgot the arithmetic of their respective strengths. And they stayed like that for a long time without speaking, the ring on her finger, the forest outside going dark with November's early evening, the house quiet around them in the way it was quiet when something significant had just occurred, and the space after it was being allowed to exist before the ordinary world resumed its claims. He did not need to tell Alice. Alice had seen it with the particular precision she reserved for events that had been decided rather than merely considered, and when they came downstairs together, she was at the bottom waiting with an expression of such complete and unrestrained delight that even Bella, who was not generally susceptible to Alice's enthusiasm on principle, laughed with genuine warmth at the sight of it. That sound, Bella's unguarded laughter filling the entrance hall of the Cullen house with the specific brightness of something real happening in real time, was the right sound for that particular moment. It was the sound of something beginning. They agreed to wait before telling Charlie, not out of doubt and not out of shame, but because Bella needed time to find the right words, and finding words for things that mattered had always required from her a particular quality of time that Edward understood and respected completely. Charlie Swan's response to this information was going to require careful navigation, and Edward, who had been absorbing the police chief's steady and entirely reasonable suspicion for the better part of a year, held no illusions about the difficulty of that conversation when it arrived. He drove home alone well into the evening, the windows of the Volvo lowered despite the cold, the night air carrying the smell of rain-soaked forest and the particular dark green quality of November in the Pacific Northwest. And he thought about Elizabeth Mason on the last night of her life, burning with fever, asking a pale doctor to save her son by whatever means were available. She had not known what she was asking for. She had simply known that she was not willing to let him go without exhausting every possible alternative to letting him go. He had spent a very long time not being entirely certain that what she had saved him into was worth the cost of the saving. The decades of hollow endurance, the voices he could not silence, the thirst he could not eliminate, the isolation of being known by no one because knowing required proximity and proximity required risk, the long grey sameness of years that accumulated without adding up to anything. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the dark for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, the forest around the house breathing its slow, indifferent breath. And he thought about a ring on a hand in a room upstairs in a small house across Forks, and he was, for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, simply and entirely certain. He went inside. The house received him with its familiar warmth, and somewhere across the dark and the rain, in a room full of books and a faded quilt and the accumulated ordinary textures of a human life, Bella Swan was sitting with her left hand in the light of her bedside lamp, and the ring was on her finger, and the future was no longer theoretical. The patrol had become a nightly habit sometime in October, though Edward could not have identified the precise evening it had shifted from occasional vigilance into something more systematic and more necessary. He moved through the forest in the hours after Bella was asleep, and Charlie's thoughts had settled into the slow, unguarded rhythms of deep sleep, following a circuit that took him around the perimeter of Forks and out into the older growth beyond the town's edges, where the trees were large enough and old enough that the forest floor beneath them was almost entirely clear, carpeted in decades of accumulated needles, silent underfoot even at the speeds he moved. He did not think of it as patrolling in the military sense that Jasper would have used the word. He thought of it as knowing what the forest held on any given night, what scents were present and what were absent, what the darkness around Bella's world contained. The distinction between those two framings mattered to him in a way that was perhaps more semantic than practical, but he maintained it nonetheless. He'd been wrong to think of it as anything other than patrolling. The night he found Victoria's scent made that clear. It came on a Thursday in the second week of November, carried on the wind from the northwest, faint enough that a less experienced tracker might have reached him. Every sense reorienting reached him. Every sense reorienting toward that single point of information with the focused, involuntary attention of a predator whose body had registered a threat before his conscious mind had fully processed what the threat was. He knew the scent immediately. He had memorized it in the months following James's death, had catalogued it from every trace she had left in her circuits around their territory, from the evidence of her presence in the forest outside Bella's house in the early weeks before she had understood that the Cullens knew she was watching. Victoria's scent was distinctive in the way that all vampire scents were distinctive, carrying the particular signature of someone who had been what she was long enough that her nature had settled into something consistent and recognizable. But it carried something else as well, something Edward had always registered when he encountered it, a quality of patient cold intelligence that distinguished it from the scent of a vampire simply passing through. She was not passing through. She'd been here recently. The scent was hours old at most, laid down with the deliberate care of someone who knew how to move through a space without leaving more trace than was necessary, which meant she had been here and had chosen to leave exactly this much evidence and no more. He followed the trail with a full engagement of every sense he possessed, his mind going quiet in the particular way it went quiet when he was tracking. the constant noise of other people's thoughts receding as the predator's focus narrowed to the task. The trail moved through the forest in a pattern that was not random, that traced a route around the perimeter of forks, with the systematic quality of someone who was learning the geography of a place, mapping its edges and its gaps and its points of access. Victoria had been studying their territory, had been walking its boundaries in the dark, building a picture of the terrain that the army being assembled in Seattle would eventually need to navigate. The trail led, as he had suspected it would, to the edge of the Quileute boundary before it vanished. She had crossed onto the wolves' land deliberately, with the specific knowledge that Edward could not follow her there, that the treaty line was a wall he could not breach without consequences that would complicate everything the Cullens were trying to maintain. She had used the boundary as an exit, which meant she understood the treaty and had planned around it. The cold intelligence in her scent was not just a quality of her nature, it was a characteristic of her mind. Edward stood at the boundary for a long time, looking into the forest on the other side, and the certainty that had been assembling itself across the past weeks resolved into something complete and unambiguous. The Seattle Army was hers. The patience of it, the scale of it, the fact that she had been circling Forks for months, while simultaneously building something in the city large enough to overwhelm the Cullens' defenses, all of it traced back to Victoria with the clean, logical inevitability of something that had always been true, waiting to be confirmed. She had loved James the way Edward loved Bella. He understood this about her in the same way he understood other things that were painful to acknowledge, by looking at them directly rather than approaching them obliquely. James had been her mate, and Edward had killed him. And what Victoria was building in Seattle was not cruelty for its own sake, but devotion in its most dangerous form. Love that had been converted by grief into something with no remaining outlet except destruction. He could feel a terrible and unwanted kinship with that. He did not permit it to become sympathy, but he acknowledged it because ignoring it would have made him less able to understand what he was facing, and he needed to understand it completely. He ran back to the Cullen house through the dark and the rain, moving at full speed, the forest blurring past him in the way it did when he stopped managing his pace for the comfort of anything other than pure efficiency. Carlyle was awake, as he often was in the late hours, reading in his study. He looked up when Edward appeared in the doorway, and whatever was in Edward's expression caused him to set his book down with the particular care of someone who understands that whatever comes next will require their full attention. Edward told him what he had found. Carlyle listened without interrupting, his expression moving through several internal responses that Edward could read clearly, the physician's careful assessment giving way to something more personal, more troubled. When Edward finished, Carlyle was quiet for a moment. "You're certain it was her?" Carlyle said. "Completely," Edward said. "I would know that scent anywhere." And the trail led directly to the Quileute line. She used it as cover. She knew I couldn't follow. Carlyle absorbed this, and Edward could hear the conclusion forming in his mind before he spoke it. "Then she has been watching us, not just Bella, all of us, mapping our territory, identifying our limitations, planning around our specific constraints. She's been doing this for months," Edward said. While we were focused on Seattle, while we were watching the army grow, she was here. Both things simultaneously. The family meeting that followed happened in the early hours before dawn. The Cullens assembled in the living room with the specific quality of attention that genuine threat produced. All of the ordinary ambient noise of the household replaced by something focused and still. Edward told them what he had found and what it meant, and the room received the information with the varying responses he had learned to read across decades of knowing these would send the newborns as the primary force, overwhelming the Cullens through sheer numbers and the particular ferocity of newly transformed vampires whose thirst was still at its most uncontrollable. And while the Cullens were engaged with our wave, she would find Bella. The army was a distraction as much as it was an assault, a mechanism for separating Bella from her protection at the moment when that protection was most occupied. "She's smart," Emmett said, and the acknowledgement carried no admiration, only the assessment of someone evaluating a tactical situation with clear eyes. "She's had years to plan this," Jasper said, "and she has been patient in a way that most vampires are not. Most of us do not wait this long for anything." The approach to Sam Yulee came 2 days later, arranged through the cautious communication channel that had been waited. The wolves came within 20 feet of the treaty line. Edward went to the treaty line in the morning, alone, and stood at its edge and waited. The wolves came within 20 minutes, which was faster than he had expected, and which suggested that they had been watching the Cullen movements with the same systematic attention that Edward had been applying to the forest perimeter. Sam appeared first in his human form at the edge of the trees on the Quileute side. The other wolves were present further back, their thoughts unavailable to Edward in the way that werewolf consciousness had always been unavailable to him, closed off behind whatever wall separated their particular kind of existence from his gift's reach. He had always found this interesting in the abstract and frustrating in the practical, this specific blind spot, though he had never said so to any of them. Jacob was among them. Edward registered his presence the way he registered all of Jacob's presences, with the complicated layering of responses that their particular situation produced, the genuine respect that had grown despite everything alongside the complicated feelings that the subject of Jacob Black and Bella Swan continued to generate. He spoke to Sam directly, explaining what he had found at the treaty line, describing Victoria's trail and what it implied about the relationship between the Seattle Army and the threat to Forks specifically. Sam listened with the still, focused attention of a leader who had learned that listening completely before responding was not a courtesy, but a tactical advantage. When Edward finished, Sam was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke with a directness that Edward had come to appreciate in him. "We've been tracking her too," Sam said. "She crossed our land twice in the past month. We lost the trail both times at the water." This was new information, and Edward absorbed it carefully. Victoria had been using the Quileute land not just as a barrier to Edward's tracking, but as active cover, moving through the wolves' territory, knowing that the wolves would not immediately connect her movements to a threat directed at the Cullens. She'd been playing both sides of the boundary, using the treaty line as a tool in both directions. "She's been studying all of us," Edward said. not just the Cullens, your patrol patterns as well. Sam's expression shifted in a way that Edward could read without the benefit of his gift, the specific quality of a leader understanding that a threat they had been monitoring had been simultaneously monitoring them. It was not a comfortable realization. The negotiation that followed was not the first careful exchange between these two groups, but it was the most substantive, the one where the theoretical cooperation of their previous communications became something operational and specific. Sam and Carlyle, who had joined Edward at the boundary as the conversation deepened, worked through the terms of what genuine coordination would require: shared patrol routes, communication protocols, the establishment of overlapping coverage in the areas around Forks where Victoria's presence had been detected, so that neither group would be operating with blind spots the other could fill. Edward served as translator in the most complete sense of the word, moving between what Carlyle was offering and what Sam was willing to accept, reading the body language and tone of the Quileute leader with the attentiveness his gift could not provide and his years of experience could. Sam was not performing reluctance. His caution was genuine, rooted in the history of his people's relationship with vampires, in the stories that had been passed down through generations about what the Cold Ones were and what they had done, and what the treaty was designed to prevent. The fact that the Cullens were different, that their dietary choices and their conduct had demonstrated something other than the predatory behavior the Quileute tradition documented, did not make that history irrelevant. Sam was asking his pack to cooperate with the thing they had been taught to fight, and the weight of that was real and deserved acknowledgement rather than impatience. Edward acknowledged it. Carlyle acknowledged it. And slowly, with the careful progression of people building something on uncertain ground and choosing to build it anyway because the alternative was worse, the agreement took shape. Jacob's thoughts during all of this were closed to Edward, as they always were, but his body language was not, and Edward read in it the particular complexity of someone managing multiple competing loyalties simultaneously. Jacob's devotion to Bella was visible in the specific quality of his attention when her name came up in the conversation, the way his posture changed slightly, the way his jaw set. He was here not only as a member of Sam's pack, but as someone who had decided independently that Bella Swan's safety was a thing he was committed to, regardless of what it required him to stand beside. Edward could not dismiss that. He had tried, in the early weeks, to frame Jacob's involvement in purely territorial terms, to reduce it to the dynamics of two groups with overlapping claims on a piece of geography. But standing at the treaty line across all the weeks of this developing cooperation, reading Jacob's physical presence every time he was part of these exchanges, Edward had been forced to acknowledge what was actually there. Jacob loved Bella, not abstractly, not performatively, but in the specific and costly way that love manifests when it is genuine, and when it knows it is not going to get what it wants, and when it shows up anyway. That knowledge was not comfortable, but it was true, and Edward had long since decided that the truth was always preferable to the comfortable alternative, even when the truth required him to respect someone he would have preferred to simply dislike. He drove home through the late afternoon with the agreement settled and the operational coordination beginning. The Quileute patrol routes and the Cullen patrol routes being mapped toward the overlapping coverage that would close the gaps Victoria had been exploiting. Alice had already begun refining her visions in light of the new information, running the possible futures forward with the change parameters, looking for the configuration where the outcome was survivable for everyone. Edward told Bella that evening, sitting in the familiar geography of Charlie's kitchen, with the rain performing its usual constancy outside. He told her about Victoria's scent at the treaty line, about what it confirmed, about the alliance with the wolves, and what it would mean in practical terms for the weeks ahead. He watched her absorb it with the focused attention she brought to things that required her full engagement, and he watched her ask the question he had known she would ask, the question she always asked when the danger was described to her, the question that consistently revealed where her attention naturally went when she was frightened. "Will everyone be safe?" she asked. "Not will I be safe. Will everyone?" "We're doing everything we can to ensure it," he said, which was the truest answer he had. She looked at him for a moment with the expression that lived behind the silence his gift could not penetrate. And then she nodded once, the nod of someone who has decided to trust a person with something significant and is doing it consciously rather than by default. Outside, November continued its patient work on forks. The forest held its breath in the particular way it held its breath when something was coming, and somewhere in the city to the south, in the industrial dark of Seattle, an army was being completed, and it was pointed here, and its creator had been walking the boundaries of this place in the dark for months, learning every gap, every limit, every line that could not be crossed, and every line that could. Victoria was patient. She had always been patient. And her patience, Edward understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent a long time learning to think like the thing hunting him, was almost finished. The knowledge arrived the way difficult knowledge often arrived, not all at once, and not from the direction Edward had been watching. He had been present at a joint patrol briefing in the forest clearing that the Cullens and the wolf pack had established as their neutral meeting point, a space equidistant from both territories, where the practical business of coordinating their overlapping defenses could be conducted without either group standing on the other's ground. The meetings had developed a rhythm over the weeks since the alliance had been formalized, a careful choreography of proximity that both groups maintained with the specific attention of people who understood that the cooperation was genuine, and also that the instinctive tensions underneath it were equally genuine and required active management rather than pretense. Jacob had been in the meeting. He was often in the meetings, his role within Sam's pack having expanded as the threat from Seattle clarified and the complexity of the coordination increased. Edward had been tracking Jacob's emotional state through the weeks of their developing alliance with the practiced peripheral attention of someone who could not access the thoughts directly, but could read the physical signals with considerable accuracy. And what he had been reading in Jacob's bearing across the past several weeks was a progressive increase in something that Edward recognized because he had felt versions of it himself. The specific tension of a person carrying a feeling that has grown too large for continued containment. It was during the patrol briefing that Jacob's thoughts, which should have been closed to Edward entirely, became partially audible through an indirect channel that Edward had not anticipated. One of the younger wolves, Paul, whose emotional regulation was considerably less disciplined than the rest of the pack, was thinking loudly about something Jacob had said the previous evening, turning it over with the restless attention of someone who found it funny and slightly uncomfortable in equal measure. The thought was specific and unguarded, and it arrived in Edward's consciousness with the clarity of something broadcast rather than whispered. Jacob had told the pack he was going to tell Bella how he felt, had told them with the particular combination of determination and defiance of someone who has made a decision and is partly announcing it and partly daring someone to argue with it, had said that whatever happened afterward, she deserved to know, that he was not willing to let the future close around a choice she had made without complete information. Edward held this piece of knowledge with complete stillness while the meeting continued around him, contributing to the tactical conversation with a portion of his attention that tactical conversations required, while the rest of him worked through what he had just learned with the careful, unhurried honesty he had committed to bringing to the subject of Jacob Black. He was not surprised. That was the first thing he acknowledged. He'd been watching this build for months, had tracked it in the quality of Jacob's attention toward Bella during the brief periods when they were in proximity, had read it in the specific way Jacob spoke when her name came into a conversation. The declaration itself was not new information. Only the timing was new, and the confirmation that it was no longer something Jacob was managing internally, but something he had decided to act on. The second thing he acknowledged was the jealousy, which arrived with its usual combination of immediacy and shame. He felt it, and he named it, and he did not permit himself the comfortable alternative of reframing it as protective concern or legitimate alarm about Bella's well-being. It was jealousy. It was the possessive, irrational, specifically human-feeling response of someone who loved a person and did not want that person to be the subject of someone else's love, regardless of whether that other love was valid or real. It was small, and it was honest, and acknowledging it plainly was the only way to keep it from quietly shaping his behavior in ways he would later have to account for. The third thing he acknowledged was harder and took longer to arrive at. Jacob's feeling for Bella was not performance. It was not the easy, uncomplicated infatuation of someone who had decided she was appealing and was pursuing that appeal without deeper investment. It was real in the specific way that things were real when they had been tested by difficulty and had survived the testing. Jacob had watched Bella choose Edward repeatedly, had absorbed that choosing each time, and had remained devoted to her well-being regardless of what it cost him personally. That was not nothing. Edward could not make it nothing, no matter how convenient it would have been to do so. The meeting concluded, and the wolves disappeared into the forest, and Edward ran home through the dark, with all three of those things sitting in him simultaneously, the knowledge and the jealousy and the reluctant respect, none of them cancelling the others out. The kiss happened on a Wednesday. Edward knew about it before Bella told him, which was its own particular experience. He'd been near enough to the boundary between Forks and the Quileute land during an evening patrol to catch the edge of Jacob's consciousness through the filter of Paul's still undisciplined mental broadcast, and what came through in the hours after Bella had visited the reservation was not detailed or specific, but was unmistakable in its emotional quality. The specific brightness of someone who has done something they had been building toward for a long time and found it was not rebuffed in the way they had feared it might be. Edward ran his patrol circuit that evening with complete physical efficiency and a mind that was working through several things at once, none of them comfortable. Bella told him the following morning, which he had known she would because she had always chosen honesty with him, even when honesty was costly. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee and her careful expression, the one she wore when she was preparing to say something she was not certain how he would receive, and she told him about the kiss. She did not minimize it or over-explain it. She gave him the facts and the context, and then she stopped talking and waited for his response with the specific patience of someone who believes in the other person's ability to handle difficult information, even when they are not certain of it. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than he intended it to be. He asked her what it had meant, not as an accusation, not as a demand for reassurance, but as a genuine question, the question he would have asked anyone he was trying to understand clearly. He needed to know what he was actually dealing with rather than the version of it that his fear would construct if he let fear do the construction. Bella's answer was honest in the way her answers always were when she had decided that the moment required complete honesty rather than careful management. She loved Jacob, she told him, not the way she loved Edward, not with the same totality, not in the way that had rearranged everything, but the feeling was real, and she was not willing to pretend it wasn't because pretending would be a lie, and she did not lie to him. Edward absorbed this. He did not perform the composed acceptance of someone who had expected this and was therefore unaffected by its confirmation. He sat with it and let it be what it was, which was painful, and he did not rush past the pain toward the resolution, because the pain was the honest response, and he had decided that honest responses, even the ones that were uncomfortable, were preferable to the managed ones that only looked better from the outside. After a while, he said, "I know." Bella looked at him. "I've known for a long time," he said. "I could not read your mind, but I could read everything else. The way you are when you come back from the reservation, the way your voice changes when you talk about him. I have known, and I chose not to name it because naming it would have required me to have this conversation, and I was not ready for this conversation." "Are you ready for it now?" Bella asked. "No," Edward said, "but I am having it anyway, which is perhaps the more important thing." The conversation that followed was the most honest one they had managed in months, possibly in the entire duration of their relationship. The kind of conversation that became possible only after something difficult had broken through the surface that had been maintained over it. Edward said things he had not said before, named the jealousy plainly, acknowledged the possessiveness he'd been managing, and the ways it had expressed itself in behavior he was not proud of. Bella said things she had been holding carefully, the specific loneliness of loving someone who was always slightly afraid of himself in her presence, the exhaustion of being loved by someone who was simultaneously terrified of hurting her. They stayed in the difficult things rather than moving quickly toward resolution, which was new and which cost both of them something, and which was, Edward thought, the right thing to do with this particular conversation. Some things needed to be sat with before they could be moved past. Jacob came to the Cullen house 2 days later, appearing at the door with the specific energy of someone who has decided to do something uncomfortable and is committed to seeing it through before the commitment can erode. Edward read his intention from the driveway before Jacob had reached the porch and met him at the door, with the careful composure of someone who had been preparing for this. They walked into the forest rather than talking in the house, both of them understanding instinctively that this conversation needed space and privacy, and the particular freedom from observation that the trees provided. They were quiet for the first several minutes, moving through the forest at a pace that accommodated Jacob's human speed, and the silence had the specific quality of two people organizing themselves before something that both of them understood was going to be difficult. Jacob spoke first, which was characteristic. He said what he felt with a directness that was one of the most consistent things about him, without the construction or the softening that Edward might have employed in the same position. He loved Bella. He had loved her for a long time, and he was not willing to disappear quietly from her life simply because she had made a choice, because choices could be revisited, and he believed she had not fully understood what she was choosing against when she had chosen Edward. Edward listened to this without interrupting. When Jacob finished, the forest was quiet around them. The rain having paused in its usual constancy for once, the air damp and still. "You are not wrong," Edward said. Jacob looked at him with the specific expression of someone who had prepared for several possible responses and had not prepared for this one. "You are not wrong that she loves you," Edward said. "I know that she does. She told me herself, and she was not saying it to hurt me. She was saying it because it is true, and because she does not lie about things that are true. You have something real with her. I am not going to pretend otherwise, because pretending would be dishonest, and it would also be insulting to both of you." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Then why are you still here?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Because what she has with me is also real," Edward said. "And because she has chosen Jacob. Not because I asked her to choose, or because I maneuvered her toward it, or because she did not understand what she was choosing against. She knows what you offer her. She has always known. And she has chosen this, chosen me, with that knowledge fully available to her." "She's 17, Jacob said. "She is," Edward agreed. "She is also the most honest person I have ever known in a century of knowing people. And when she tells me she is certain, I believe her. Not because I want to believe her, because I have learned to trust her knowledge of herself." Jacob looked at him for a long time, and Edward, who could not read his thoughts and was therefore working entirely from the surface, read something in his expression that he had not expected to find there. Not the anger he had anticipated. Something more complicated and more painful. The specific grief of someone who has made their argument as well as it can be made, and can hear that it is not going to change the outcome. "If she changes her mind," Jacob said, "if she ever changes her mind, then that will be her choice to make," Edward said, "and I will not stand in the way of it." The silence that followed this exchange was different from the silence that had preceded it. Something had shifted in it, some of the adversarial quality replaced by something that was not comfort exactly, but was the particular texture of two people who have said the true things to each other, and are now simply in the presence of what those true things mean. "You actually love her," Jacob said, and it came out less like an accusation and more like a conclusion arrived at with some reluctance. "Yes," Edward said simply. "So do I," Jacob said. "I know," Edward said. "I have known for a long time, and whatever you believe about me, Jacob, I want you to know that I do not dismiss that." "What too?" Jacob looked away into the trees for a moment, and when he looked back, his expression had settled into something quieter and more resigned. Not acceptance exactly, something on the way to it, or perhaps something that would become acceptance given enough time. They walked back toward the house in a silence that was no longer hostile, moving through the wet November forest with the specific careful distance of two people who have negotiated something difficult and are not yet certain what they are to each other now that the negotiation is over. Edward stood in the forest after Jacob had gone, alone with the rain beginning again in its soft November way, and he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what the past week contained. The jealousy, still present, still honest. The grief for what Jacob was carrying, which was real and which Edward felt as a genuine thing rather than a performance of magnanimity. The complicated gratitude for Bella's honesty, for her willingness to tell him the difficult true things rather than protecting him from them with comfortable approximations. And beneath all of it, the thing that had held through every difficult day of this particular chapter, steady and specific, and not requiring constant reassurance to remain intact. He was certain of her, not because she had told him what he wanted to hear, but because she had told him the difficult things and chosen him anyway, with full knowledge of what she was choosing against. And that choosing was the most real thing he had encountered in a century of existence. He turned back toward the house. The forest settled around him in the dark, and somewhere across Forks, in a small room with a faded quilt and a stack of worn books, Bella Swan was carrying the weight of a choice she had made clearly and completely, and whatever the choice had cost her, she had not asked to be released from it. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The clearing they had been using for training was approximately 2 miles east of the Cullen house, deep enough in the forest that the sounds produced by their sessions would not reach any human settlement, wide enough that the full range of vampire movement could be accommodated without the constraints that came with working in confined space. Edward had been to this clearing hundreds of times across the years the family had lived in Forks, had hunted through it and run through it, and sat in it on occasions when solitude and open sky were what the moment required. He knew it the way he knew most things in this forest, with a complete and unreflective familiarity of long acquaintance. It looked different now. The same trees, the same dimensions, the same carpet of winter grass going soft at the edges with the persistent damp of a Pacific Northwest November. But the purpose imposed on it had changed the quality of it, had made it into something with edges and stakes, and the specific charged atmosphere of a space where something important was being prepared. Jasper had been the one to select it. walking the available options with the systematic assessment of someone who is thinking about sightlines and approach vectors and the tactical implications of every geographical feature. Edward had accompanied him on that initial survey and had watched his brother move through the forest with a specific bearing that was emerging more fully with each passing day, as the reality of what was coming clarified. The military Jasper becoming less something that appeared in moments of acute threat and more a constant presence, integrated into the ordinary texture of how Jasper occupied himself and the space around him. The training had been Jasper's proposal, offered to Carlyle in the measured, precise language of someone presenting a tactical recommendation to a commanding officer rather than a family member. The newborns in Seattle were being built for a specific kind of fighting, Jasper had explained, the kind that relied on the explosive power of the newly transformed and the overwhelming chaos of numbers. The Cullens were experienced fighters individually, but their experience was distributed across centuries of largely independent existence and had not been specifically developed for the coordinated engagement of multiple opponents simultaneously. They needed to practice. They needed to develop instincts for working together that went deeper than communication and planning. Instincts that would function in the chaos of actual combat when communication and planning became impossible. Carlyle had agreed without hesitation. Esme had said nothing, which was her way of saying what she felt without requiring it to be addressed directly. Jasper began with the history, because the history was the foundation of everything else, because the tactical knowledge he was carrying could not be transmitted effectively without the context that explained how it had been acquired, and what it had cost, and why it was therefore reliable in ways that theoretical knowledge was not. He gathered the family in the Cullen living room on a Tuesday evening, all of them present, and he stood in a way he had not stood in this house before, not the carefully managed casualness of someone performing relaxation, but the upright, contained posture of someone who has decided that what they are about to say deserves to be stood up straight for. Edward listened to every word and simultaneously read what lay beneath the words. The emotional landscape that Jasper was navigating as he spoke. The places where his control over that landscape was effortful rather than automatic. The history was not new information to Edward in its broad outline. He knew about Maria, knew about the Southern Wars, knew that Jasper had come from a world of deliberate and systematic violence that made the Cullen family's particular challenges look almost pastoral by comparison. But knowing the outline and hearing the full account, rendered in Jasper's own voice, with the specific details that the outline had always omitted, were two different experiences. Maria had been building armies in the south of the continent since before Edward had been transformed, operating in the territories that ran through what was now northern Mexico and the southern United States, competing with other vampire factions for control of the feeding grounds that the dense human populations of those regions provided. The Southern Wars had their own rules, their own particular brutality, the specific logic of a world where power was the only currency that held its value, and where the most efficient path to power was the creation and deployment of newborn vampires whose strength in their first year of existence surpassed anything an older vampire could match in direct physical terms. Jasper had been exceptional in this world, and he said so without false modesty, because false modesty about tactical capabilities was a luxury that the current situation did not permit. He had understood instinctively what most vampires took years to learn, or never learned at all: the principles of coordinated movement and positional advantage, and the management of multiple opponents whose individual strength exceeded his own. Maria had recognized what she had in him and had used it comprehensively, and Jasper had served her purposes with the complete effectiveness of someone who had not yet found a reason to refuse. He described the newborns with the specific knowledge of someone who had spent decades managing them, fighting alongside them and against them, understanding their capabilities and their limitations with a precision that no amount of theoretical study could have produced. Their strength in the first months was extraordinary, genuinely exceeding what older vampires could generate, the transformation process producing a peak of physical power that gradually diminished as the first year passed and the body completed its full conversion. Their thirst was constant and overwhelming, consuming the majority of their attention and making sustained tactical thinking nearly impossible. They fought with instinct rather than strategy, which made them dangerous in a specific way, unpredictable in the moment, but ultimately limited by the absence of the kind of adaptive intelligence that experience produced. The way to fight them, Jasper said, was not to match their strength directly, but to redirect it, to use their own momentum and their thirst-driven aggression as tools to position and move in ways that denied them the straightforward physical confrontation where their power advantage was most complete. Edward watched the family receive this information. Emmett was entirely focused, his usual broad expressiveness replaced by the specific quality of attention he brought to things that engaged his fighting instincts genuinely rather than theoretically. Rosalie was still and precise, committing the tactical details to the permanent memory they all possessed. Esme was present and attentive, and carrying the particular expression she wore when something was happening that she wished were not necessary, and was nonetheless fully committed to, because the alternative was unacceptable. Alice was tracking her visions against the tactical framework Jasper was providing, running the images she had been accumulating forward through the new lens of his expertise, finding places where the futures she had been seeing became more legible. And Carlyle was watching Jasper with an expression that Edward recognized as the one Carlyle wore when he was confronting the full reality of something he had known in outline for a long time. He had known Jasper's history, but hearing it rendered in this specific, operational detail was reminding him visibly of what Jasper had been, and what he had survived, and what it had taken to survive it, and the love in his expression alongside the grief for what his son had carried was one of the most human things Edward had witnessed in a very long time. The training sessions began the following weekend, incorporating the wolf pack on the third day, once the initial coordination between the Cullens had been established well enough that introducing additional variables would not undermine what had been built. The wolves arrived at the clearing with the specific energy of their kind, the heat and the size and the way their presence altered the atmosphere of a space, and the Cullens received them with the careful composure of people who had been practicing exactly this kind of composure for months, Edward's role emerged naturally and quickly, because it was the role that his particular gift made inevitable. He could not overpower a newborn the way Emmett could not manage the emotional atmosphere of a group the way Jasper could not generate the tactical anticipation from visions that Alice provided. What he could do was know what was coming a fraction of a second before it came, could read the intention in a mind before the intention became action, could call out what was approaching before it arrived. He was the signal, the early warning, the voice in the chaos that told everyone else which direction to face. Jasper worked with him specifically on this during the first training session, standing opposite him in the clearing and running through a series of movements designed to test the reliability and the speed of the translation from Edward's perception to his communication. How quickly could he convert what he read in a mind into a word or a gesture that the people around him could act on? Could he maintain that translation under the physical pressure of his own simultaneous engagement with an opponent? What were the conditions under which the channel became unreliable? They discovered several things. The translation was fastest when Edward stayed mobile rather than stationary, when the physical engagement of his body was running parallel to the mental work, rather than requiring him to hold still for it. It was least reliable when he was processing multiple minds simultaneously at close range, the overlapping signals creating a brief compression that cost him a fraction of a second. And it failed almost entirely in the rare instance of an opponent who wasn't thinking in coherent language, whose consciousness was so dominated by the thirst and the frenzy of newborn existence that the signal was more sensation than thought, and required a different kind of reading. Jasper incorporated these findings into the training design with the efficiency of someone who had been working with variable asset capabilities for decades, and understood how to build around limitations rather than pretending they did not exist. The Wolfpack's fighting style was their own, and was not going to be modified to align with the Cullen's approach, which was both understood and respected. What needed to be developed was the coordination between the two groups, the ability to operate in the same space without either group interfering with the other's movement or inadvertently directing a newborn towards someone who was not prepared for it. This required practice, and it required a degree of mutual trust that could not be manufactured, but could be developed through repeated exposure to each other's capabilities and limitations. Jacob and Emmett ended up training in proximity more often than anyone had initially planned, their complementary fighting styles creating a natural pairing that both of them acknowledged with the specific reluctance of two people who had found something useful in someone they had not expected to find anything useful in. Edward watched this development with the quiet attention he brought to things that were unexpected and therefore interesting, noting the way Jacob and Emmett communicated during training, the shorthand that developed between them with the organic efficiency of people who discovered a genuine tactical compatibility. There were moments during the training sessions when Edward lost himself in the work the way he rarely lost himself in anything anymore, the tactical focus demanding the complete engagement of every capability he possessed, leaving no room for the personal complications and emotional management that the rest of his life required. In those moments, the clearing was simply a problem to be solved, and the people moving through it were simply elements of a solution, and the part of his mind that was always listening, always reading, always processing the ambient tide of other people's consciousness, was finally being used for something that felt proportionate to its cost. Jasper found him at the edge of the clearing, at the end of the third full training session. The wolves already gone, the rest of the family drifting back toward the house. The evening was settling into the deep dark of a Pacific Northwest winter night, the temperature dropping steadily, the rain holding off for once, in a way that felt like a concession from a sky that was not generally in the habit of making them. They stood together for a while without speaking, which had always been a possibility with Jasper. In a way it was not with most people. The silence comfortable in the specific way that silence was comfortable between two people who'd spent enough time in each other's presence that the absence of conversation did not require filling. "You were in that world too," Jasper said eventually. It was not a question. "Not the same world," Edward said. "Not the armies, not the wars, but the years I spent away from Carlisle, hunting human prey, telling myself the targets deserved it. I know what it is to be the thing we are training to stop." Jasper was quiet for a moment. "Does it help?" he asked, knowing that. Edward considered this honestly before answering. "It helps me understand what we are fighting," he said. "It does not help me feel better about what it required to acquire that understanding." "No," Jasper agreed. "It never does." They stood in the dark of the clearing while the forest settled around them into its nighttime rhythms. The distant sounds of the family moving through the house, drifting toward them on the still air. And Edward thought about the weeks ahead, about the shape of what was coming, about the army being completed in Seattle and the patient intelligence directing it, and the morning that was going to arrive when all the preparation and training would be required to prove itself against something real. He looked around at the clearing, at the torn earth that marked where they had been working, at the forest holding the space with its enormous, indifferent permanence, and he felt something that was not quite calm but was the closest thing to it that the situation permitted. They were as ready as they could make themselves. The people standing in the valley below the mountain when the army arrived would not be unprepared. Whatever happened next, they had done the work. That had to be sufficient. He chose to let it be sufficient. He turned back toward the house, where the lights were warm against the winter dark, and the people he loved were moving through the ordinary evening of a night that was still, for now, safe. The rain began again as he walked, soft and consistent, the sound of it filling the forest with its familiar constancy, and Edward let it cover the distance between the clearing and the house. Let it be simply what it was. Rain on the forest in November in Forks, Washington. The most ordinary thing in the world. The plan had been Alice's in its essential architecture, built from the fragments of futures she had been assembling across the weeks of preparation, running the variables forward and backward through the shifting possibilities until the configuration that produced the best outcomes became visible. The logic of it was straightforward. Once the pieces were in place, the newborn army would track by scent. If Bella's scent could be elevated above the valley, where the battle would occur, carried upward and away by the mountain winds before it could reach the forest floor where the fighting would happen, the army's attention would not be divided between the Cullens and the human they had been sent to find. the Cullens could engage without the complication of a simultaneously running protection operation, and Bella would be as far from the violence as the geography permitted. Edward would stay with her. This had not been a point of discussion. He had stated it as a fact, and Carlyle had received it as a fact, and the planning had proceeded on that basis. And if there was a part of Edward that understood with cold clarity that he should be in the valley with his family, that his ability to read the newborn's intentions in real time was a tactical asset that would be genuinely missed. He set that understanding aside with the same deliberate motion he used to set aside anything that competed with the absolute priority of Bella's safety. He would not be in the valley. He would be on the mountain. That was the whole of the calculation. They left before dawn on the morning of the planned battle, the timing dictated by Alice's most recent visions, which had settled into a clarity that suggested the army would move on Forks within the next 24 hours. The air when they stepped outside was the specific cold of a late spring night at elevation, the kind of cold that had teeth in it, that communicated its intentions clearly. Edward had checked the weather systems moving through the region with the thorough attention of someone for whom weather had become a tactical variable, and what the systems were showing was not reassuring. A storm was building over the mountains, larger and faster than the forecasts had indicated, the kind of systems that the Pacific Northwest produced occasionally, with the casual, destructive indifference of a landscape that did not particularly concern itself with human planning. He carried most of what they needed. Bella walked beside him on the trail that led up through the forest toward the high meadows, her breath visible in the cold air, her pace steady and deliberate, in the way her pace was always deliberate when she was concentrating on not stumbling, which in difficult terrain was essentially always. He stayed close without hovering, close enough to catch her if the trail became treacherous, far enough that she was doing the walking herself and not being managed through it. They did not talk much on the climb. The mountain required enough of Bella's attention that conversation was an additional demand rather than a comfort, and Edward was occupied with the multiple threads of awareness he was maintaining simultaneously. The tracking of the valley below through the fragments of his family's thoughts that reached him at this distance, the monitoring of the weather systems, the mapping of their position against the plan Alice had constructed. The silence between them was companionable rather than strained, the silence of two people who had been through enough together that not speaking was simply another form of being present. The campsite was a ledge of relatively flat ground at the edge of the tree line, sheltered on 3 sides by rock and on the 4th by a stand of old-growth fir, whose canopy provided some protection from precipitation. Edward assembled the tent with the efficiency of someone who had done it before, the structure going up in the grey pre-dawn light, while Bella sat on a boulder and watched him work with the quiet attention she brought to things she found interesting without feeling the need to comment on. He had arranged the sleeping bag and the extra blankets with perhaps more care than the task strictly required, layering them with the specific thoroughness of someone who is thinking about heat retention in deteriorating conditions. The storm arrived faster than the worst of his projections. By mid-morning, the sky had closed to a flat, impenetrable grey, and the temperature had dropped with a suddenness that the body registered before the mind caught up to it. By early afternoon, the wind had found the campsite with the purposeful consistency of wind at elevation, moving through the gaps in the rock shelter and making the tent's thin walls shudder with a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a complaint. And by the time the light began its early descent toward evening, the snow had started. Not the gentle, exploratory snow of a system still deciding itself, but the committed, horizontal snow of a storm that had made up its mind. Bella was cold in the specific way that humans became cold, when the conditions exceeded the capacity of their clothing and their body, heat to manage them. The kind of cold that was no longer just uncomfortable, but was using physiological resources that could not be indefinitely replaced. She had the sleeping bag pulled around her shoulders and 2 blankets across her lap, and Edward's arm around her, and she was still shaking, the fine involuntary tremors of a body working hard to maintain its core temperature against the mathematics of the situation. He held her and felt his own inadequacy, with the specific sharpness of someone confronting a limitation they cannot think their way around. He was cold, not in the way she was cold, not with any physiological distress, but cold in the way that marble was cold, in the way that stone left in shadow for a century was cold, and the warmth she needed was warmth he could not generate, and the understanding of that fact sat in him like something with weight. He had called Jacob before the storm had fully closed in, the call brief and direct and carrying the specific humility of someone who had identified the correct solution to a problem and was not going to allow pride to stand between that solution and the person who needed it. Jacob had not made it difficult. He had heard the situation and had said he would come, and had ended the call without the commentary that he might have been entitled to offer. And Edward had registered this as the specific decency it was. Jacob arrived at the tent in the full dark of the storm. His presence announced to Edward by the particular combination of heat and scent that was distinctively his, and to Bella by the sudden warmth that radiated from him, even before he had fully entered the tent. The temperature differential between his body and the air around them so dramatic that it was physically perceptible from several feet away. The logistics of the arrangement required a moment of practical negotiation that neither of them made more fraught than it needed to be. Jacob settled into the sleeping bag beside Bella with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone resolving a logistics problem, and the effect was immediate and significant. The shaking that had been wearing Bella down for hours beginning to ease within minutes as his body heat transferred into the sleeping bag and into her. Edward sat against the opposite wall of the tent and watched this happen, and managed his response to it with the thorough, practiced control of someone who had spent a century managing responses to things that were difficult. The difficulty was real. He was not going to pretend, even in the privacy of his own mind, that watching Jacob Black hold Bella through a storm on a mountain was a neutral experience. The jealousy was present. He named it and set it alongside the gratitude, which was also present and also real. The uncomplicated relief that she was warming, that the shaking was easing, that the mathematical problem of her survival in deteriorating conditions had been solved. Both things could be true simultaneously. He had been learning this lesson in various forms across the entire duration of Eclipse, and he was not done learning it. Bella slept. The storm outside continued its work, the wind finding every gap and the snow accumulating on the tent's outer surface with a weight that Edward monitored with the peripheral attention he kept for structural concerns. He was not worried about the tent. He was, in the precise and specific way he was always in some register, worried about Bella, watching the quality of her sleep and the steadiness of her breathing and the color returning to her face as the hypothermic risk receded. Jacob spoke quietly into the dark, and Edward heard the assumption in the quality of his voice. The assumption that Edward was asleep or close enough to sleep, that the words were private, that they were going somewhere beyond the walls of the tent, rather than into the consciousness of the person sitting 6 feet away in perfect stillness. He let Jacob speak. The choice to maintain the pretense of sleep was made in a fraction of a second, and it was not dishonest in the way that deliberate deception was dishonest. It was the creation of a space in which Jacob could say what he had been carrying without the performance that consciousness of an audience would have required, and whatever Edward learned from what was said in that space, he had decided he would be honest about having heard. Jacob talked about Bella with the specific and unguarded quality of someone who has stopped managing what they reveal. The love in his voice was the kind that did not bother with decoration, that stated itself plainly because the person speaking had moved past the point where plain statement felt like vulnerability. He talked about what he wanted for her, about the future he could see for them if she would let herself see it, about the things she would have with him that she could not have with Edward. The warmth, the life, the ordinary human trajectory of years that added up to something visible and shared and lived in the daylight rather than hidden from it. He talked about Edward with the complicated honesty of someone who had been forced by circumstances into genuine knowledge of a person they had preferred to simply oppose. He said things that were not kind, and things that were not unkind, and things that were simply accurate, and Edward received all of it with the stillness of someone who had decided that accuracy deserved reception regardless of its comfort level. Then he spoke to Bella directly, quietly, his voice dropping further, and he said the things that were most private, the things he had been carrying since the beginning of this chapter, and his voice in those moments had the quality of something being set down after a long time of being carried. Edward opened his eyes. The tent was dark, the storm outside filling the silence with its continuous work, Bella's breathing steady in the sleeping bag between them. Jacob looked at him with the expression of someone who has just understood that the conversation they believed was private was not, and the sequence of responses that moved through his face was rapid and readable, the initial alarm giving way to something more complicated. "How long?" Jacob said quietly. "Long enough," Edward said. The silence that followed had several things in it. Edward let it exist for a moment before he spoke again, choosing his words with the care he brought to things that mattered. "You love her," Edward said. It was not an accusation, it was an acknowledgement, offered with the specific respect that honest things deserved. "You love her, and you are here on this mountain in a storm, holding her warm because that is what she needs, and you are doing it without asking for anything in return. I am not going to pretend that I don't understand what that costs you." Jacob was quiet. "I want to ask you something," Edward said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, the way I am going to answer, honestly, when you ask me the same thing in return." Jacob looked at him across the dark tent, across the sleeping form of Bella between them, and nodded once. "If she had chosen you," Edward said, "if she had made that choice clearly and completely, would you be able to let her live the life that came with it? Not the life you want for her, not the life you think she should want, but the life she had actually chosen, with all of its complications and all of its costs. Would you be able to hold that and still be what she needed you to be?" Jacob was quiet for a long time, long enough that Edward thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Yes, because it would be what she wanted." "Then you understand," Edward said, "why I am still here." Jacob looked at him, and the understanding that moved through his expression was not comfortable and was not accompanied by anything that resembled acceptance. But it was genuine, which was more valuable than comfort. "Ask me yours," Edward said. "If she changes," Jacob said, "if she becomes what you are, and somewhere in all those years she realizes that she made the wrong choice, will you let her go?" "Yes," Edward said, and the word cost him something measurable, and he said it anyway, because it was true. "If she ever tells me that she has chosen differently, I will not stand between her and that choice. I will not hold what she gave me as a claim on what she wants next." Jacob absorbed this in the specific quiet of someone who had expected a different answer and was dissolved into a silence that was dissolved into a silence that was different from all the silences that had preceded it. Not comfortable, not resolved, but honest in a way that neither of them had managed with the other before. An honesty between two people who had been each other's obstacle for the better part of a year was its own kind of progress. Dawn came eventually, as it always did, the storm having exhausted itself sometime in the deep middle of the night, the light arriving pale and thin, and entirely indifferent to everything that had occurred beneath it. Bella stirred in the sleeping bag, her heartbeat shifting from the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep into the lighter patterns of waking, and the world outside the tent was white and still, and the valley below them was waiting. Edward watched the morning light reach her face and felt the familiar convergence of everything he felt for her, the love and the terror and the gratitude and the impossible luck of being the person she had chosen. And he held it all without trying to organize it into something more manageable. The tent held the warmth that Jacob's body had generated through the night. Bella was safe. Below them, the valley was quiet for now, and whatever the day was about to require of all of them, they had arrived at it intact. That was sufficient. He chose, as he'd been learning to choose across this entire chapter, to let it be sufficient. The valley sounds reached Edward on the mountain as fragments, arriving and dissolving in the spaces between gusts of wind that the storm had left behind in its passing. Not the sounds of the battle itself, not at this distance, but the thoughts of the people engaged in it, flickering through his range with the intermittent quality of a signal crossing difficult terrain. Alice's consciousness was the clearest, her mind the most familiar to him after decades of proximity, and he tracked her through the morning with the focused attention of someone using the only information channel available to them, and aware that the channel was imperfect. He stayed very still on the mountain. This was the discipline the morning required of him, the specific and costly discipline of remaining in place while his family was in the valley below, and he could not help them, could not add what he would have added if he had been there, could not do anything except hold his position and trust the people he loved to do what they had spent the past weeks preparing to do. He had been practicing this kind of stillness his entire vampire existence, the management of instinct through conscious choice, the insistence of the will over the body's demands. He was practiced at it. It was still very hard. Seth Clearwater sat several yards from the tent in his human form, his presence a specific kind of reassurance that Edward had not fully anticipated when the plan had been assembled. Seth was the youngest member of the wolf pack and the most constitutionally cheerful, which was a combination that should have produced a kind of relentless brightness that Edward would have found wearing in the current circumstances. Instead, Seth's particular quality of ease had a different effect entirely, something that functioned more like steadiness than cheerfulness, the specific calm of someone who was not performing the absence of fear, because the fear itself was genuinely not their dominant response to this situation. Edward had developed a specific regard for Seth across the weeks of joint training that he had not developed for most of the wolf pack, a respect that was not complicated by the competitive dimensions that complicated his regard for Jacob, or the wary mutual assessment that characterized his relationship with Sam. Seth was simply good, genuinely uncomplicated good, the kind that did not require maintenance or careful management, and that produced in his presence a quality of ease that was rarer than it should have been. Bella was sitting at the entrance to the tent, wrapped in the sleeping bag that still held the warmth of the previous night, watching the valley through the gap in the tree line where the mountain fell away toward the lower forest. She had been mostly quiet since waking, the particular inward quiet of someone who understood the weight of the day and was a shift in Alice's thoughts came in mid-morning, the images becoming sharper and then suddenly, without transition, urgently present. The battle had begun. Edward tracked it through Alice's consciousness with the concentrated intensity of someone receiving information they cannot act on, but must nonetheless receive completely, storing every fragment, building the picture of what was happening in the valley below from the incomplete and rapidly shifting images that Alice's gift was generating in real time. The newborns were moving with the chaotic force that Jasper had described, the thirst-driven aggression of the newly transformed making them powerful and directionally difficult to predict. The Cullens and the wolves were working the plan, the coordinated positioning that the training had built into something closer to instinct than calculation, and it was holding, imperfectly and with cost, but holding. He was tracking a particular exchange through Emmett's consciousness, his brother's specific way of thinking in combat, both familiar and vivid. When the wind shifted on the mountain and the scent arrived, he knew it before he had processed knowing it, his body already reorienting, every sense redirecting toward the source, with the involuntary totality of a response that preceded conscious decision. Victoria's scent, fresh and purposeful and coming from the east, from the direction of the ridge above the campsite, moving through the morning air with the specific quality of someone who had been very careful for a very long time and had now decided that the time for carefulness was over. She had planned for this. The understanding arrived in Edward's mind with the cold completeness of a puzzle assembling its final piece. She had always planned for this, had been planning for it across the months of patient preparation. The army in Seattle, never the whole of the strategy, but only the first part of it. The mechanism for drawing the Cullens and the wolves into the valley and occupying their attention and their defensive positioning, while she went over the top of the mountain and came down on the other side and found Bella guarded by one vampire and one young wolf, rather than 7 experienced fighters. She had been 3 moves ahead from the beginning. Riley was with her. Edward read his mind as they came over the ridge and began descending toward the campsite, reading it with the full attention of someone who needed to understand exactly what they were dealing with. And what he found in Riley's consciousness was something that required him to revise his tactical assessment almost immediately. Riley was not a calculating operator in Victoria's mold. Riley was in love, genuinely, devastatingly, completely in love with Victoria, in the specific way that people who had been transformed by someone they loved were in love with that person. The bond of the transformation overlaid with the bond of the feeling until the two were indistinguishable from each other. He believed what she had told him, believed that the Cullens had done something that warranted this response, believed that his role in what was about to happen was justified, believed in Victoria with the total commitment of someone who had organized their entire existence around a single person and could not afford to examine that organization too closely. Edward rose from his position and placed himself between the approaching figures and the tent where Bella sat, his movement carrying the complete commitment of someone who has reached the end of the space where strategy lives and entered the space where only response remains. Seth moved to his left without being asked, his transformation happening in the fluid way of an experienced shifter. The wolf settling into the space beside Edward with the heat and the size and the focused attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment with the specific patience of a young person who had decided what they were willing to do and was now doing it. Victoria stopped at the edge of the tree line above the campsite. Riley stopped beside her. The distance between the two groups was perhaps 30 yards, and Edward could read both of them clearly at this range. Victoria's mind with the practiced blankness of someone who had learned to think in ways that revealed as little as possible. Riley's with the open clarity of someone who had never learned to guard his thoughts because the person who could read them had never been in his life before this moment. "You chose an interesting place to watch a battle," Victoria said, and her voice carried the quality that Edward had always registered in it when he had been close enough to hear it. A studied lightness that was the surface layer of something enormously patient and enormously cold underneath. "You chose an interesting strategy," Edward said, "sending your army as a distraction while you came over the mountain. You've been planning this for longer than we realized." Something moved in Victoria's expression, a fractional acknowledgement, the specific response of someone who's been understood precisely and is deciding what to do with that understanding. Then it was gone, and the studied lightness returned. "James would have appreciated it," she said. "Yes," Edward said, "he would have." He spoke to Riley then, directly, turning his attention to the other mind with the full intention of using what he had found there. This was not cruelty. It was the only weapon he possessed in this specific moment that did not require him to close the distance between himself and Victoria while Bella remained unprotected behind him. And he used it with the precision it required. He told Riley the truth. Not a tactical version of it, not a version constructed to produce a specific response, but the actual truth as he had read it from Victoria's mind in the seconds of her approach. She did not love Riley. She had transformed him and used him, and directed his feeling for her as a resource in the way that Maria had directed Jasper's capabilities as a resource, with the cold efficiency of someone who understood that love was a force that could be aimed. Riley's role in her plan had never included a future. It had included only utility. He watched the truth arrive in Riley's consciousness, and he watched Riley's response to it. The specific sequence of a person receiving information that dismantles something they have organized their existence around. The disbelief first, and then the reaching for alternative explanations, and then the terrible clarity that came when the alternative explanations ran out. Victoria's voice cut across before Riley could resolve what he was experiencing, sharp and specific, redirecting his attention. And Edward watched her manage Riley's doubt with the expertise of someone who had been managing it for months, who knew exactly which words to use to reinforce the structure she had built in him and seal over the cracks that honesty had opened. The fight began without further ceremony. Victoria came at Edward with the full speed of a vampire who had been alive for long enough to have developed her capabilities well beyond the baseline of her transformation. And he met her with the complete engagement of his own capabilities, reading her intentions a fraction of a second before they became action, and moving accordingly. The gift that made him least useful in straightforward physical combat, making him nearly impossible to approach effectively in this kind of one-on-one exchange. She was fast, and she was experienced, and she was fighting with the specific motivation of someone who had been directing this moment toward this conclusion for years, and those things made her dangerous in ways that could not be entirely managed by any tactical advantage. Seth took Riley with the ferocious effectiveness of someone fighting to protect something specific, the young wolf moving with the focused aggression of his kind at its most committed, and Edward tracked their exchange in his peripheral awareness while keeping the primary focus of his attention on Victoria. She was trying to get past him. That was the consistent thread in her strategy across the minutes of their exchange, every feint and movement and tactical variation returning to the same essential goal. Not to defeat Edward, but to get past him, to Bella. Edward read this in her mind and responded to it directly, positioning and repositioning to deny her the angle she was seeking, staying between her and the tent with the absolute commitment of someone who had reduced the entire situation to a single imperative. He spoke to her while they fought, because the part of him that had been reading her mind since she had come over the ridge had assembled something that he needed her to hear, not for tactical reasons, but because it was true, and because truth, even in the middle of violence, was something he could not entirely set aside. "You loved him," Edward said, maintaining his position, tracking her approach. "James, you loved him the way I love her. I understand that. I understand why you are here." She stopped moving for a fraction of a second, and he read what that fraction of a second contained. The specific way that being accurately understood struck her. The grief that existed beneath the cold patience, the loss that had been the engine of 3 years of elaborate and meticulous revenge. "Then you understand why this ends the way it ends," she said. "I understand why you need it to," Edward said. "That is not the same as letting it." The fight resumed, and Edward stopped talking and gave himself entirely to what the moment required. The reading and the moving and the complete commitment to the single outcome that mattered. And when the opening came, he took it with the decisiveness of someone who had been waiting for it without impatience, reading its approach in her mind before it arrived, and being positioned for it before she understood it had been offered. Victoria's patience, which had been the most formidable thing about her across 3 years of careful, building, devastating strategy, became in its final moment the thing that undid her. She was so accustomed to the long view, to the patient approach, to the waiting for the right conditions before acting, that the speed of the ending caught her entirely by surprise. The stillness afterward was absolute. Seth finished with Riley in the same general moment, the sounds of their exchange ceasing with the specific abruptness that marked the cessation of a fight rather than its pausing. Edward turned, and Seth was standing in his wolf form at the edge of the tree line, breathing hard, unhurt, his amber eyes moving between Edward and the tent where Bella sat. Bella was standing at the tent entrance, her face carrying the specific pale stillness of someone who has just witnessed something that cannot be processed immediately and has not yet decided how to begin the processing. She was unhurt. Her heartbeat was rapid but present, strong. The sound of someone alive and responding to what they had just seen, rather than the sound of someone in physical distress. Edward crossed to her without ceremony and put his arms around her with the careful, thorough gentleness of someone who had just been reminded with absolute precision why the careful gentleness mattered, and she held on to him with both hands and said nothing for a long time, and he did not require her to. The sounds from the valley had changed while the mountain fight was occurring, settling from the chaotic sounds of active combat into something quieter and more conclusive. Alice's thoughts had clarified, the images no longer fragmentary and urgent but steady and accessible, and what they showed was a valley clearing of the chaos that had characterized the last several hours, and a family that was intact, and a wolf pack that had taken losses they could survive. The Volturi arrived before any of them had fully processed that the battle was over. Edward heard Jane's mind from a considerable distance, tracking the approach of the small guard across the forest below, with the specific alertness that any Volturi consciousness produced in him, the combination of recognition and wariness that he had developed across every encounter with the vampire royalty of Volterra, Jane and Felix and Dimitri and several others, moving through the forest with the unhurried efficiency of people who had never been in any danger of arriving in time to help, and who had no particular interest in whether that was noticed. They came into the valley clearing while the Cullens and the wolves were still processing the aftermath of the battle, and the quality of their entrance was entirely characteristic of the Volturi at their most deliberate. The specific choreography of people who understood that timing and presentation were forms of power, and who had been practicing both for centuries. Jane's expression as she surveyed the clearing was the one Edward had always found the most difficult to read, the carefully maintained blankness that was her default register, broken occasionally by something that was not quite a smile, but functioned like one. She was cataloguing. He could read that much even through the practiced discipline of her thoughts, the systematic assessment of what was present and what it implied about the Cullens' capabilities and relationships and the degree of independence they were exercising in their territory. Bree Tanner was crouching at the far edge of the clearing. Edward had noticed her before the Volturi arrived, had registered her presence in the aftermath of the battle with the immediate attention that any unknown vampire consciousness produced in him, and what he had found when he read. Her mind had caused him to make a specific decision before the Volturi came into his range. She was terrified, not in the performing way that creatures of their kind sometimes produce terror as a social signal, but with the genuine, overwhelming fear of someone who had no framework for what was happening to her, who had been transformed weeks ago by someone she had barely known, who had been pointed at a city and given no context for why, who had survived the battle in the valley through some combination of luck and instinct, and had emerged from it into a clearing full of vampires whose intentions she could not read. She was perhaps 15 in human years, and she had been a vampire for less than 2 months, and she knew almost nothing of what had been done to her or why. Edward stepped toward her before the Volturi reached the clearing, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who wanted to be read as non-threatening to a person who had every reason to read everything as reason to. He told her that there were reason to. He told her that there were things she deserved to know about what she was, and that if she would stay calm, he would help her understand what was happening. She looked at him with the red eyes of the newly transformed and the specific expression of someone who's been offered something they want badly enough to risk believing it might be true, and she stayed still. Carlyle was there immediately, his physician's instinct for de-escalation as natural to him as breathing had once been, speaking to Bree with the calm authority of someone whose manner had been producing trust in frightened people for 3 centuries. The girl's terror did not disappear, but it shifted, becoming something more manageable, the specific quality of fear that has found a handhold rather than fear in free fall. Jane reached the clearing. Edward read her assessment of the situation with the quick efficiency that proximity to Volturi required, and what he found in her thoughts when her gaze reached Bree was not the consideration of options that the word assessment implied, but the immediate, settled conclusion of someone who had already decided what the outcome would be before she understood all of the variables. Bree was a loose end. The Volturi did not prefer loose ends. The question of what to do with a newborn who had survived the battle she had been created to fight was not, in Jane's mind, a question that admitted of multiple answers. Edward spoke before Jane could act, presenting the case for Bree's survival with the full precision of someone who understood that he had a very small window and needed to use it completely. Carlyle spoke as well. The argument was not strategic, not constructed around the Volturi's interests, because the Volturi's interests in this situation did not include Bree's survival, and pretending otherwise would have been both transparent and counterproductive. the argument was simply human, or as close to human as the circumstances permitted. The argument that this person had not chosen what had been done to her and had not acted with full knowledge of what she was participating in, and deserved the opportunity to be something other than what she had been created to be. Jane listened with the specific quality of listening. That meant the speaker was being heard without any particular likelihood of the hearing changing the outcome. Felix moved into position with the efficiency of long practice, and Edward read Jane's decision in her mind in the moment before she enacted it, and knew that the window had closed. He didn't look away. He had decided that he would not look away, that Britannia deserved to have someone witness what was done to her with the full attention of someone who understood that what was being done was wrong, even if understanding it could not, had been delivered through action rather than words. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message was clear. They were not going to let Jane go. The Volturi's message had been delivered through action, rather than words with the efficiency that the Volturi preferred. The message was clear. The Cullens had managed their territory effectively on this occasion. The alliance with the wolves was noted and would be remembered and would be discussed in Volterra. The question of Bella Swan's continued human existence was also noted and would also be remembered, and the Volturi's patience on that particular matter was not inexhaustible. All of this was communicated through the quality of Jane's departure and the specific things that were not said rather than the things that were. Edward stood in the valley clearing after the Volturi had gone, and his family was gathering around him, and the wolves were moving through the forest on the other side of the meadow. And he looked at the space where Bree Tanner had been, and he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. All of it. The victory and the loss and the cold. Reminder that the Volturi clock was running, and had always been running, and that the summer, which had just begun to take shape as something survivable, was not the end of anything, but only a pause between one kind of danger and the next. He turned toward Bella, who had come down from the mountain with Seth while the aftermath was being managed, and who was standing at the edge of the clearing with the specific expression of someone who had seen too much in one day and was doing the quiet, necessary work of integrating it. He went to her. The valley was quiet around them. The forest held its breath in the way it always held its breath after something enormous had passed through it, and the evening was beginning to find the sky, and they were alive, all of them, and that was the beginning of the accounting. The day after the battle had the particular quality of days that follow enormous things, the specific texture of ordinary time reasserting itself over the space where something extraordinary had occurred. Forks continued its familiar rhythms with the indifferent persistence of a place that did not know what had happened in the valley to its east, the rain returning in the morning with its customary lack of ceremony, the town moving through its routines with the comfortable obliviousness of people whose safety had been maintained precisely because they remained unaware of what that maintenance had required. Edward sat in Bella's kitchen while she slept late into the morning, which he needed and which he had ensured by being present through the night, sitting in the chair by her window and listening to her breathe through the slow hours while his mind worked through the accounting of everything the previous day had contained. The accounting was long, and not all of it was comfortable, and he did not rush it, because rushing it would have meant setting aside things that deserved to be held, and he had made a commitment to himself across the course of this particular chapter that he was going to hold the difficult things rather than manage them into something more convenient. Victoria was gone. The army she had spent 3 years building was gone. The specific, patient, devastating threat that had been organizing itself around Bella's existence since the night in the ballet studio was finished, and the finishing of it had cost what it had cost, and had left what it had left, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and neither one cancelled the other. Bella came downstairs in the mid-morning, her hair loose around her face, wearing the particular expression of someone who had slept deeply but not long enough, the tiredness still present beneath the restored colour in her cheeks. She found him at the kitchen table and sat down across from him without speaking for a moment, and they looked at each other in the quiet way of two people who have been through something together and are still in the early stages of understanding what that togetherness means for what comes next. She asked about his family first. She always asked about his family first, which was one of the things about her that he had never stopped noticing. The consistency of it, the way her attention moved outward before it moved inward, even in the moments when she had every right to be focused entirely on her own experience. He told her that everyone was intact, that the cost had been real but survivable, that Carlyle had tended to the injuries through the night, that the family was home and resting, and that the particular quality of aftermath that followed genuine danger was present in the house, but not the quality of catastrophe. She received this with the specific relief of someone for whom the information was genuinely the most important thing she had needed to hear. Then she asked about Jacob. He told her what he knew, which was not everything, because Jacob's consciousness was closed to him, and the specifics of how Jacob was processing the aftermath were not information Edward possessed. What he knew was that the wolf pack had taken losses they could survive, that Jacob had been present and effective in the valley, that Seth had reported his brother uninjured. Beyond that, he could only tell her what he had observed, rather than what he had read. Bella was quiet for a moment, and Edward watched something move through her expression with the attention he brought to the things in her face that were trying to tell him something her words were not yet ready to say. Then she looked at him directly with a particular quality of directness she reserved for things she had already decided. "I need to see him," she said. "Before anything else happens, before we move forward with anything, I need to see Jacob." Edward looked at her for a moment, reading what was underneath the request, understanding its shape and its necessity. She was not asking permission, and he was not going to offer it or withhold it. She was telling him what she needed and asking implicitly whether he understood. "I know," he said. "I need to say goodbye properly," she said. "Not to him, not to us, but to the version of the future where I chose differently. It's real enough that it deserves a real ending." He understood this completely, in the specific way he understood things about Bella that she had not fully articulated, the understanding that came from years of paying the closest possible attention to someone whose mind he could not read, and who had therefore taught him to read everything else about her with a thoroughness that no other relationship had ever required of him. "I'll take you to the line," he said. The drive to the treaty line had a different quality from every previous version of that drive, and Edward was aware of the difference with the attentiveness he brought to things that were occurring for what might be the last time in a particular form. Bella was quiet beside him, looking out the window at the familiar geography of forks moving past, and the silence had the inward quality of someone organizing themselves for something they know will be difficult and have decided to do carefully rather than quickly. He parked at the edge of the logging road, and she got out and looked at him across the roof of the car for a moment with the brown eyes that had never once given him access to what was happening behind them. And he held her gaze and tried to put into his expression what he wanted her to know, which was that he was not afraid of this, that he trusted her, that she should take whatever time she needed. She nodded once and turned and walked into the trees. He did not go to the boundary's edge this time. He stayed by the car and leaned against the door and let the forest be simply the forest. Let the silence be simply silence, without filling it with the anxious monitoring he had once brought to this particular weight. He had a book in the car and he read it with genuine attention, which would have been impossible 3 months ago, and which was therefore a kind of evidence of something, a marker of the distance he had travelled across the course of this chapter. The waiting was not without feeling. He was not performing equanimity he did not have. There was real discomfort in knowing that on the other side of the invisible line, Bella was saying goodbye to something that had been real, that the conversation happening in whatever space she and Jacob had found was a genuine conversation between two people who loved each other and were navigating the specific grief of a choice that could not be unmade. He held the discomfort rather than eliminating it, because the discomfort was the honest response to an honest situation, and he had committed to honesty even when the comfortable alternative was available. He'd been reading for nearly an hour when he heard her, with her face showing what it was showing, and he set the book on the passenger seat and straightened and waited. She came through the trees with her face showing what it was showing, which was grief, clean and present and not hidden. The specific expression of someone who has said a real goodbye and is carrying the weight of its reality without pretending it is lighter than it is. Her eyes were not red, which meant she had not been crying, but they had the brightness that preceded tears that had been held rather than released, and he recognized that brightness as the face of genuine feeling rather than the performance of it. He opened the passenger door without speaking, and she got in, and he walked around to the driver's side and started the engine, and they were on the road back toward Forks before either of them said anything. "He's going to be okay," Bella said finally. Her voice was steady in the specific way that voices were steady when the things. He is one of the most genuinely things. He is one of the most genuinely strong people I have encountered. That is not a small thing. Bella looked at him, and he could see the surprise in her expression at this. The slight recalibration required to receive a genuine acknowledgement of Jacob from Edward, without the protective armor of skepticism she had learned to deploy around the subject. "You mean that?" she said. "I do," he said. "I have not always been able to mean it, but the events of the past several weeks have made a number of things clearer than they were, and that is one of them." She was quiet for a moment, and then she reached across and took his hand on the gear shift, her fingers warm against his cold ones, and they drove the rest of the way to Forks with her hand in his, and the comfortable silence of two people who had moved through something difficult and were now provisionally and with full knowledge of the provisionality on the other side of it. The decision to tell Charlie happened that evening, which was not the timeline Edward had anticipated, but which he understood immediately as the right one when Bella announced it with the specific tone of someone who has made up their mind and is informing rather than consulting. She had come home from the treaty line and had changed her clothes and had eaten something and had then come downstairs with the expression that meant she had finished deliberating. "Tonight," she said. "I need to tell him tonight." Edward received this with the equilibrium he'd been developing across the chapter. The equilibrium of someone who had learned that Bella's decisions about her own life deserved to be received as the decisions of someone with full authority over that life, rather than processed through the filter of his own preferences about timing and approach. He was also, he acknowledged privately, deeply apprehensive about Charlie Swan's response to the information they were about to give him, and the apprehension was proportionate to his understanding of Charlie as a person. Charlie Swan was a man who communicated most of what was most important to him through what he did not say, through the specific silences and the careful neutrality of someone who had learned that direct expression invited complications he lacked the vocabulary for. Edward had been reading the subtext of Charlie's feelings about him for the better part of a year, and what he had read was not encouraging as a foundation for the conversation that was coming. He sat in the living room while Bella talked to her father in the kitchen, which is where Charlie preferred to have serious conversations. The familiar geography of the kitchen providing a stability that the living room, associated with guests and social performance, did not. Edward could hear the conversation with his ears and could read Charlie's emotional responses in real time through the involuntary broadcast of his surface thoughts. And the combination of these two information streams gave him a more complete picture of what was happening than either would have provided alone. Charlie's first response was the one Edward had predicted, the specific quality of silence that meant the information had arrived and the processing had not yet begun. Then came the disbelief, not hostile but genuinely confused, the response of a man who'd been constructing a different future in his mind and was being asked to rapidly revise the construction. Then the protective anger, swift and instinctive. The father's response to the word marriage attached to his 17-year-old daughter and the pale, strange boy who'd been the center of too much that Charlie did not understand. Edward heard Charlie say Bella's age in the tone of someone presenting an argument they consider unanswerable. He heard Bella respond with the patient specificity of someone who had anticipated this argument and had prepared for it not with counter-arguments, but with simple clarity about who she was and what she knew about herself and what she had decided. The conversation continued for a long time, moving through the territory that Charlie needed to move through, the objections and the fears and the eventual, gradual, reluctant recognition that his daughter had made a decision with the same thoughtful completeness she brought to everything she decided, and that the decision was not going to be unmade by the fact of his discomfort with it. Edward heard the moment when Charlie's resistance shifted from active opposition to the resigned love of a father who understood that his child had grown into someone whose choices he did not control and could not control and perhaps should not want to control. He heard Charlie ask, with the gruffness of someone performing displeasure while feeling something more complicated, whether Edward had asked him first. He heard Bella's response, which was precisely what it should have been, which was that the permission that mattered was hers. The long silence that followed this response contained, in Edward's reading of it, more genuine respect than Charlie had yet managed to direct at Bella in the conversation. The specific quality of a parent recognizing their child as someone who has become themselves. Charlie came into the living room with the specific expression of a man who has arrived at a position he did not choose and is deciding how to inhabit it with dignity. He looked at Edward with the assessing directness of a police chief and a father simultaneously occupying the same person, and Edward held the look without performing anything, without the managed charm he had sometimes deployed in Charlie's presence when the situation seemed to call for it. This moment deserved something more honest than charm. Charlie extended his hand. Edward shook. It and the handshake had the quality of something that was many things simultaneously. A greeting and a warning and a provisional acceptance, and an acknowledgement that certain things had been decided by people with the authority to decide them, and that the world would continue to turn around those decisions regardless of any individual's comfort with them. "You'll take care of her," Charlie said. It was not a question. "With everything I have," Edward said, and the simplicity of the statement was the most honest thing he could have offered in response to the most important thing Charlie Swan had ever said to him. Charlie nodded once and went back to the kitchen, and the evening continued around them with the specific quality of evenings that have contained something significant and are now allowing the ordinary to reassert itself gently around the edges of what has changed. Bella appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who has just done something difficult and is slightly surprised to find themselves intact on the other side of it. Edward crossed to her, and she leaned into his shoulder with the ease of long practice, and they stood like that in the quiet of her house, while Charlie moved through his kitchen and the rain continued its patient attendance on the windows. He drove home in the late evening with the particular quality of attention he brought to nights that had been full, the kind of nights that needed to be sat with rather than immediately analyzed. The Cullen house was warm and bright when he arrived. The family distributed through its rooms with the specific quality of presence that followed danger survived. Each person engaged in the particular thing that helped them return to themselves after the demands of the exceptional had been met. Esme was in the garden despite the hour and the rain, her hands in the soil that she had been tending since they had come to this house. Carlyle was in his study. Alice was with Jasper on the back porch, not talking, simply present with each other in the way they were present with each other when words were not the required thing. Edward went to the piano. He had been returning to the piece he had been composing in fragments across the months of Eclipse, the one that had begun as Bella's lullaby in its original form and had been accumulating new material as the chapter progressed. The way that pieces accumulated material when they were being composed by someone whose life was providing the content. He sat at the bench and put his hands on the keys and began to play, not from the beginning, but from the place where the new material started, the place where the music had changed in response to what the fall and winter had contained. The Jacob theme was there, which he had been resisting for weeks and had finally stopped resisting because the resistance was dishonest, and dishonesty expressed through music was something he was constitutionally unable to sustain. It was complicated, the Jacob theme, neither resolved nor discarded, sitting in the piece the way its subject sat in the actual landscape of their lives, real and present, and carrying its own weight without displacing what was already there. The Victoria theme ended. He had been working on the ending for weeks and had not been satisfied with it, had felt it arriving at resolution too easily, the musical equivalent of a sigh of relief, which was not the right ending for something that had been as serious as what Victoria had represented. He found the right version of it that night, the ending that acknowledged the cost of the ending, rather than simply enacting the release of tension, and he played it through twice and was satisfied. And then the new section, the one that had no name yet because it was still becoming itself, the music of the future that was no longer theoretical, that had a shape and a date and a ring on a finger, and the father's reluctant handshake and all the specific, ordinary, miraculous weight of things that had been chosen rather than simply happened. Bella appeared in the doorway at some point while he was playing, which he was aware of without stopping, and she came and sat beside him on the bench with the easy familiarity of someone who had sat in this place before and knew its particular dimensions. He continued playing, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her there, the specific quality of her presence that he had never been able to adequately describe and had stopped trying to describe because the inadequacy of language around it was itself a kind of information. He played until she fell asleep against him, her breathing evening into the slow, steady rhythm of deep sleep, her head a warm weight against his shoulder that he held carefully and did not shift. The house was quiet around them, the family having moved through their various returns to themselves and settled into the deep hours. The rain outside was the rain it always was, the most constant thing in this place, the thing that had been falling on this forest before any of them had arrived and would continue falling long after. Graduation was 2 weeks away, the wedding after that, transformation after that. The entire architecture of a future that had been assembled across months of difficult, necessary, transformative experience, standing clear and present and no longer frightening in the way that it had frightened him at the beginning of this chapter, when he had not yet understood that the fear itself was surmountable, that choosing something and staying with the choice through everything that tried to undo it was what transformed the theoretical into the real. He looked at the ring on Bella's hand where it rested against his arm, catching the low light of the room, and he thought about Elizabeth Mason's hands and the Chicago that no longer existed, and the boy who had died there, and the long, strange journey between that death and this moment, this room, this person sleeping against his shoulder with her future shaped and chosen and beginning. He was not afraid of forever. For the first time in a century of existence, he was not afraid of forever. He was, in the specific and quiet and completely genuine way of someone who has arrived somewhere after a long journey and recognized the arrival for what it is, ready for it. The rain fell on Forks. The forest breathed its slow breath outside the walls of the house, and in the room where the piano stood, Edward Cullen sat in the dark with Bella Swan sleeping beside him, and the future enormous before them both. And he was still, and he was certain, and he was home. Eclipse is the chapter of Edward Cullen's story defined not by the danger that was survived, but by the choice that was made, and made freely, against the full weight of everything that argued against it. He came into this chapter afraid of losing Bella to a love that was warmer and simpler and less, a sentry becoming someone who could choose restraint over instinct, who could hold the monster at a distance through sheer force of will. And Eclipse asked him whether that discipline extended to the hardest thing, which was not fighting a newborn army or tracking a patient and brilliant enemy through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, but simply trusting the person he loved to know her own heart. She did know it. She had always known it. Bella Swan faced a genuine alternative, a real and warm and human future that was available to her and that she understood completely, and she turned toward Edward with open eyes and a full accounting of what she was walking away from. And the turning was not a default or a resignation, but an actual choice, made with the specific clarity of someone who has looked at both paths and selected one with intention. That is what Eclipse gave him. Not safety, not resolution. The Volturi clock continues to run. The world of their kind will not leave them in peace indefinitely. The future they are building carries within it complications that have not yet declared themselves fully. None of that has been resolved. But Bella knows her mind, and Edward knows that she knows it, and the foundation of what they are building is therefore something more durable than hope. It is a decision, held between two people who chose it clearly, at cost, with full knowledge of what the choosing required. So let that be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. Not the battles or the cold clarity of the Volturi in the valley clearing, or the grief of a young wolf on a beach at La Push. Let it be the piano in the quiet house, and the rain on the forest, and a ring catching the low light of a room where something enormous has been decided and is now simply resting, the way all decided things eventually rest, in the ordinary peace of what has been chosen and will not be unchosen. The darkness holds nothing threatening tonight, only the sound of rain on the old growth trees of Forks, only the slow breathing of someone sleeping beside the person who loves her most completely in the world, only forever, beginning quietly, the way the best things begin. Drift now. Let the rain find you. Let the forest hold you. And sleep. Good night.